Darius Blackwell planted himself in the middle of the ranch yard with his arms crossed, and his chin lifted like he owned every acre of Silver Briar, which, as far as he was concerned, was only a matter of time. "Turn that wagon around," he said. His voice carried the kind of flatness that men use when they want you to know they aren't asking. "Mrs. Lockridge doesn't take on drifters, especially ones dragging children around like extra baggage." The smaller boy couldn't have been more than 6 pulled his father's coat tighter around himself and didn't make a sound. But his eyes were fixed on Darius with an expression no child that age should have learned yet. Quiet, careful, like he already knew that some men enjoyed saying no. Everett Clayborne looked at the foreman for a long moment. Then he looked down at his boys. He didn't answer Darius. He just sat there on that worn saddle with the Wyoming wind, cutting through everything that wasn't thick enough to stop it, and he waited. Because a man who has already lost most things learns that some fights aren't worth starting in the wrong yard. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever watched someone stand their ground when they had nothing left to stand on, hit that subscribe button and come with us to the end. Every week, we bring you stories like this one, raw, real, and built from the kind of human truth that doesn't fade. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories travel farther than we ever expected, and we want to see exactly how far this one goes. The morning Everett Clayborne rode through the outer gate of Silver Briar Ranch, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind smelled like iron and coming snow. October in Wyoming didn't ease into cold. It arrived the way creditors arrived, without warning and without sympathy. He had $43 in his coat pocket. He'd counted it twice in the dark that morning before his boys woke up, because he had a habit of hoping the number had changed overnight. It hadn't. $43 and a horse that was starting to favor her left foreleg on hard ground. Tobias was riding behind him on the same animal, arms wrapped around his father's midsection, pretending not to be cold. He was 9, and he had made a private decision sometime around August that pretending not to be cold was part of being the kind of son his father needed. So he didn't say anything about the wind. He didn't say anything about the fact that they hadn't eaten a proper meal since 2 days ago in Cotter's Creek, when a woman at a boarding house had taken pity on them and handed Everett a plate of beans through the back door without charging him. Wesley was 6 and operated under no such discipline. He had claimed the space inside Everett's unbuttoned coat the way small creatures claim warm places practically and without apology. Only his eyes were visible, scanning the fence line of Silver Briar with the serious attention of someone conducting an inspection. "Big," Wesley said. "Don't stare," Everett said. "I'm not staring." "I'm looking." "Same thing, it isn't," Wesley said, in the tone he used when he was certain of something, but understood that pushing too hard would result in consequences. He pulled back into the coat. "It's a real big ranch." It was. Everett had worked enough spreads across 3 territories to recognize quality land the moment he saw it. The fencing was good, not perfect. He could already spot 2 sections that needed attention, but maintained well enough that someone cared. The cattle visible in the far pasture were heavy and healthy. The barn and stable complex near the main house had the settled, permanent look of buildings that had been built to last, rather than thrown up fast. Silver Briar was the kind of ranch that serious money had created and serious management had kept running, which made him wonder as he rode toward the main yard why a ranch this well-established was advertising for seasonal hands. He'd seen the notice tacked to a post in Delwood 3 weeks ago, written in careful handwriting on good paper. It had listed fair wages. It had not listed the name of the owner, which was unusual. He hadn't thought much about it at the time, because he was in no position to be selective. The main yard was active with mid-morning work. 3 hands were moving hay near the barn. A 4th was working with a young horse in a paddock off to the left. Not well, Everett noted. The animal was nervous and the man working her was getting frustrated, which was exactly the wrong response. 2 women were carrying something toward the main house. Nobody paid Everett immediate attention when he rode in, which was typical. Drifters asking for work showed up at ranch gates, often enough that the hired hands had learned not to get invested until someone with authority decided to get involved. Then the foreman appeared. He came out of the barn with a piece of harness in one hand, and the particular walk of a man who has decided, before he even knows what the situation is, what his answer will be. He was somewhere around 50, broad through the chest, with a thick, dark mustache shot through with gray and small eyes that made quick calculations. Darius Blackwell stopped about 8 feet from Everett's horse, looked at the two boys, looked at the horse, looked at the gear tied behind the saddle that represented everything Everett currently owned in the world, and crossed his arms. "Turn that wagon around," he said. "Mrs. Lockridge doesn't take on drifters, especially ones dragging children around like extra baggage." Wesley's grip tightened on Everett's shirt beneath the coat. Tobias, behind him, said nothing. But Everett felt the slight shift of the boy's posture, the way he straightened, like he was preparing for something. "I'm not looking for charity," Everett said. His voice came out level. He'd had this conversation in enough ranch yards that he'd learned how to keep the anger out of it. "I saw a posting for seasonal work in Delwood. I ride, I fence, I work horses. My boys are no trouble. That posting was for single men," Darius said. "We don't have accommodations for—" He gestured vaguely toward the boys' complications. Everett took a breath. He looked at the fence section to his right, the one he'd clocked as needing attention. 2 posts were leaning. The wire between them was sagging on the ground in one spot, which meant any cattle with ambition and a low opinion of boundaries could walk right through it. "That section to your east," Everett said. 2 posts need resetting, and about 40 feet of wire needs retightening. If you've got cattle on the other side, you've got a problem you don't know about yet." Darius didn't look at the fence. "I didn't ask for an inspection." "I know. I'm giving you one free." Something moved in Darius's expression, not quite anger, not quite respect. More like a man who has just been handed a fact he would prefer not to acknowledge. "Move on," Darius said. "We don't need—" "Who's we?" The voice came from behind Darius, from the direction of the main house. It was a woman's voice, clear and carrying, with the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. Vivian Lockridge was 32 years old, and she walked across her ranch yard the way she walked through most things, with her chin level and her eyes taking in everything. She was wearing a dark work dress with a heavy canvas coat over it, her dark hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen weather. She was not dressed for receiving visitors. She was dressed for work, which Everett respected immediately, even before he'd formed any other opinion. She stopped beside Darius, looked at Everett, looked at the boys. "Darius," she said, "I heard the last part of that." "Which fence section?" "It's nothing—" "Which section?" A pause that lasted just long enough to have a meaning. "The east line, near the Connolly boundary." Vivian looked at Everett. "You spotted that riding in?" "Yes, ma'am." "How bad?" 2 posts, maybe 3, if the third one looks as soft as it does from here. The wire's ground level for about 40 feet. If you've got cattle on the north side, they may have already found it." Vivian looked at Darius again. Darius said nothing. She looked back at Everett. "What's your name?" "Everett Clayborne." "These are my sons, Tobias and Wesley. How long have you been riding?" 20 years, give or take. I've worked cattle from Texas to Montana. Horses, fencing, general ranch work. I don't drink and I don't cause problems." Those are the things every man says when he wants work. "Yes, ma'am. The difference is some of them are telling the truth." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across Vivian's face. She didn't let it fully arrive. "Where are you sleeping?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Wesley's head emerged slightly from beneath the coat, and he looked at Vivian with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to hide his curiosity behind manners. "We slept in a barn last night," Wesley said, in the factual tone of someone providing relevant information. "It wasn't a bad barn. There was a cat." Tobias, behind Everett, made a sound that was not quite a groan. Vivian looked at Wesley for a moment. Then she said, "Was the cat friendly?" Wesley considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Somewhat." A real silence fell over the yard. One of the hands near the barn had stopped pretending to work and was watching openly. Darius was very still. "I can't make any promises," Vivian said. "And I'm not in the habit of taking on workers I don't know. But I can offer a week's trial. Wages to be determined at the end of it, depending on what you actually contribute." She paused. "Darius will show you where you can stable your horse. There's a bunkhouse that isn't in current use. It's not comfortable, but it's shelter." That's more than enough, Everett said. And he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Darius turned toward Vivian with the practiced expression of a man who has learned to object without appearing to object. Mrs. Lockridge, we discussed the staffing situation, and I thought we agreed. I'll have Renata put together something for the boys, Vivian said, and she walked back toward the house. Darius stood where he was for a moment after she left. Then he turned to look at Everett with the particular expression of a man filing something away for later. Follow me, he said. There was no welcome in it. The bunkhouse was at the back edge of the yard, behind the stable. It had been abandoned long enough to collect 2 years of dust and one family of mice behind the south wall, and the stovepipe had a joint that had worked itself loose some time during the previous winter, which explained why it was cold enough inside to see your breath, despite the fact that it was still technically October. Tobias walked through the door, looked around, and said nothing. He set down the small pack he'd been carrying across his back and began looking for the mouse situation because finding problems was something he could actually fix. Wesley stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, examining the space with an expression Everett recognized. The careful look his younger son used when he was deciding whether something was safe enough to believe in. It's got a roof, Wesley said finally. It does, Everett agreed. The last place we stayed didn't. Really, part of it was missing. I remember. This is better. Everett set his gear down against the wall and looked at the loose stovepipe joint and began calculating what he needed to fix it. He had a small toolkit in his saddlebag. Not much, but enough for basic repairs. The stove itself looked functional. He'd have to get wood. Papa, Tobias said from the corner where he was crouched near the wall, I think the mice are gone. There's old droppings, but nothing fresh. Good. I can fix the joint on the stovepipe if you hand me the pliers. I'll do it. You said I could start learning more. Everett looked at his older son, who was 9 years old and already bargaining with quiet patience, and thought about everything that 9 years had made Tobias into a boy, who knew how to build fires and check a horse's hooves and patch canvas and sleep without complaint in places no child should have to sleep. Pride and guilt arrived at the same time, the way they always did. Fine, Everett said. Pliers are in the right side of the kit. They had the stove going by mid-afternoon. Tobias had fixed the pipe joint badly enough that Everett had to adjust it twice, but on the third attempt it held, and they both pretended the first two hadn't happened. A woman Everett didn't recognize yet appeared at the door with a basket bread, cold roasted meat, dried apples, and a jar of something preserved that turned out to be plum jam. She introduced herself as Renata, said she cooked for the main house, looked at Wesley with the careful attention of a woman assessing whether a child was being adequately cared for, and departed without much additional conversation. Wesley ate half a piece of bread with plum jam and then stopped and looked at it. What, Everett said. I want to save some for later. You don't have to save it. There's enough. Wesley considered this. The idea that there was enough of something enough that you didn't have to ration it before it was gone was still an idea that required his active consideration. He took another bite. Tobias ate quickly and efficiently, the way he ate everything, then sat with his back against the wall and looked at the stove. Is she the owner? He asked. The woman outside. Mrs. Lockridge. Yes. She doesn't seem like what I expected. What did you expect? Tobias thought about it. Someone older. Someone who would just say no and close the door. People surprise you. You always say that, because it keeps being true. Tobias looked at the fire through the small iron grate of the stove door. How long do you think we'll stay? She said a week trial. But how long do you think? Everett looked at his son for a moment. Tobias was not asking about a week. He was asking the real question, the one that had been underneath everything for months. The question about whether there was somewhere they were going or whether they were just going. I don't know, Everett said. Let's see if we earn the week first. He was up before dawn the next morning. He didn't wake the boys, let them sleep in a real bed for the first time since he could accurately remember. The cold air hit him when he stepped outside, and he stood for a moment letting his eyes adjust to the dark, getting a sense of the yard. The ranch was quiet but not silent. He could hear cattle in the distance, the particular low murmuring sound a herd makes when it's settled. From the stable came the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. A lantern was already lit in the main barn, one of the early hands making his rounds. Everett walked the fence line first. He'd spotted the east section from the road, and he'd said 2 or 3 posts, but he wanted to know exactly what he was dealing with before he went looking for tools. He found 4 posts that needed attention, not 3, and about 60 feet of wire that needed retightening along the ground rather than 40, which meant whoever had been responsible for that section had either not walked it recently or had walked it and hadn't bothered. He noted it and kept moving. By the time weak light was beginning to come up in the east, he'd walked most of the south and east fence lines, identified 2 additional sections that needed work, found a drainage problem near the lower pasture that was going to cause mud issues before the hard freeze came, and noticed that the gate latch on the western livestock entrance was failing. Not broken yet, but close enough that a determined cow or a decent wind event would take care of it. He went to find tools. The tool storage was at the back of the main barn, organized with the particular logic of someone who had a system and expected others to understand it, which meant it would take him a few days to fully figure it out, but the basics were clear enough. He found a post pounder, wire stretchers, staples, and a bucket he could use for mixed cement for the worst of the posts. He was loading what he needed onto a small handcart when he heard footsteps behind him. "You're up early." It was Darius, appearing in the barn doorway with a coffee mug and the expression of a man who has arrived to monitor something. "Fence line to the east needs more work than it looked from the road," Everett said. 4 posts and about 60 feet of wire. I know what the fence line needs." "I'm sure you do." Everett kept loading the handcart. "I thought I'd start there. The other hands have assignments." "I'm not asking about the other hands." A pause. Darius stepped into the barn, set his coffee mug on a barrel, and crossed his arms. "Let me tell you something, Clayborne. This isn't the first time somebody's rolled up to Silver Briar looking to make themselves useful to Mrs. Lockridge. You're not the first man with a sob story and a couple of kids she's felt sorry for." Everett didn't look up from the handcart. "I'm not looking for her to feel sorry for me. She's a widow with more money than she has reason to keep alone," Darius continued. "Men notice that. They notice it very specifically, if you understand me." "I understand you." Everett stood and turned to face the foreman. "And I'll tell you something back. I don't care about her money. I care about feeding my sons and not sleeping in a ditch in November. If the work doesn't speak for itself in a week, I'll go." Darius looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that's doing more than looking. "See that it does," he said, and picked up his mug and left. Everett fixed the east fence line by early afternoon. He reset 4 posts with new cement bases where the old ones had rotted soft, retightened 63 feet of wire, and replaced 2 gate hinges on a section he found while he was out there that hadn't been on his original mental list. He went back for more staples around noon and passed one of the other hands, a young man named Carl who couldn't have been more than 23, coming out of the main barn with a bridle in his hands and a confused expression on his face. "You the one who fixed the east line?" Carl said. "This morning." Carl looked at the bridle in his own hands and seemed to be doing some internal accounting. "Darius had me scheduled for that this week. He didn't mention it." "No," Carl said. "He usually doesn't." He paused, then added, in the tone of someone sharing information that might be relevant, "He doesn't mention a lot of things to people he doesn't plan on keeping around." Everett filed that away. Wesley found Vivian at 3 o'clock that afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden on the south side of the main house, doing something with the last of the autumn kale that involved more cutting than seemed strictly necessary. And she did not immediately notice a 6-year-old in an oversized coat materializing at the edge of the fence and watching her with the focused attention of a naturalist documenting a rare bird. "You're cutting it wrong," Wesley said. Vivian looked up. "If you cut it too low," Wesley explained, with the patience of someone who had clearly given this speech before, "it doesn't grow back next season. You're supposed to leave the crown." Vivian looked at the kale in her hand. She looked at the cutting point. She looked at Wesley. "Who told you that?" she said. "A woman in Laramie. She had a garden. She let me help." He paused. "Her name was Mrs. Okafor. She gave me seeds, but we lost them in Cotter's Creek when the wagon got stuck in the creek." Vivian was quiet for a moment, then she said, "What's your name again?" "Wesley Clayborne." "Wesley. Would you like to come through the gate?" He considered this with the appropriate seriousness of someone evaluating an invitation. Then he unlatched the gate. He had to reach up for it, but he managed and came through. Tobias found the stable. More specifically, he found the young horse he'd seen, being worked badly the previous morning, a dark-coated filly about 3 years old, in a stall by herself at the far end of the stable. She was not injured, but she had the look of an animal that had been frightened enough times that frightened had become her baseline state. She didn't come to the stall door when he approached. She moved to the back corner and stood there with her ears pressed flat. Tobias didn't try to touch her. He found an empty bucket near the stall, turned it upside down, and sat on it about 4 feet from the stall gate, and stayed there. He didn't speak to her. He didn't make any particular noise. He just sat. She watched him from the back corner with her ears flattening and releasing, trying to figure out what kind of threat this was. He sat there for 40 minutes. By the end of it, she had moved 2 steps closer to the gate. Everett was back at the bunkhouse, cleaning up before dinner when Carl appeared again, this time without the bridle, and with an expression that had a specific quality to it, the look of someone who had decided to say something and was committed enough that he was going to say it quickly before he changed his mind. "The ledger books," Carl said, "in the main office." Everett looked at him. "Darius keeps a second set," Carl said. "In his quarters, in a wooden box under his cot. I'm not saying I know what's in it. I'm just saying it exists." He paused. "I've been here 4 years. I need this job, so I can't be the one to say anything about it. But a new man asking questions, that's different." He left before Everett could respond. Everett stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and thought about that for a while. Then he washed his face and went to get his sons for dinner. The ranch hands ate in a separate room off the kitchen. Renata cooked for everyone, and the meals were plain and substantial and served without ceremony. There were 7 hands, including Everett, and they ranged in age from Carl's 23 to a weathered man called Dutch, who was somewhere north of 60, and had been at Silver Briar long enough that he appeared to have grown into the landscape. Wesley sat between Everett and Dutch and ate his beans with the focused energy of a child who has learned to eat quickly in case the food disappears. Dutch watched him without appearing to watch him, which was the particular skill of an old ranch hand who had learned to observe without commenting. "You're the one working the east fence today," Dutch said to Everett without preamble. "That's right. Good work." He said it like it cost him something. "Needed doing for 2 months. Why wasn't it done?" Dutch looked at his beans. "Priorities," he said, in a tone that made the word mean the opposite of what it usually meant. Across the table, one of the other hands, a man named Garrett, who had the particular stillness of someone who spent most of his energy making sure he wasn't noticed, did not look up from his plate. But his fork paused for exactly 1 beat. Everett noted that too. The corral situation happened by accident. After dinner, while Tobias helped Renata carry dishes to the kitchen door, in the particular way he'd developed of inserting himself into useful tasks without being asked, Everett walked toward the stable to check on his mare. She'd been given a proper stall and feed, which was more than he'd expected, and he wanted to look at her foreleg again in better light. He was passing the main corral when he noticed the mare. She was Vivian's. He'd seen the horse earlier in the day and registered her quality automatically, the way he registered such things. A blood bay, probably 9 or 10 years old, with the bone structure of something that had been carefully bred rather than accidentally produced. She was standing near the rail on the far side of the corral, and she was favoring her left foreleg. 2 hands were leaning on the fence near the gate, talking. Neither of them was looking at the mare. Everett went to the rail and watched the horse for a moment. Then he said, to nobody in particular, "How long has she been walking like that?" One of the men, not Carl, not Garrett, someone he hadn't learned the name of yet, turned and looked at the mare with the expression of someone seeing a thing for the first time that had been there for a while. "She's been a little off today, I guess. Did anyone pull her shoe?" A pause. "She doesn't like having her feet handled," the man said. Everett looked at the mare for another moment. Then he went into the corral. She did not trust him immediately. She moved away when he approached, turning her body to present her shoulder rather than her face, which was a defense maneuver rather than an attack, which was a good sign. He kept his approach slow and direct, not making any sudden movements, talking to her in a low and purposeless way. Not sweet talk, just words, just sound. It took him about 6 minutes to get close enough to touch her neck. Another 4 to convince her to tolerate him, lifting her foot. The stone was lodged between the shoe and the sensitive inner heel of her hoof. Not huge, but positioned badly enough that every step transferred pressure directly onto the damaged spot. He worked it free carefully with the hoof pick from his back pocket, the one he always carried the same way some men always carried a knife. The mare put her foot down, shifted her weight, stood more evenly. "Papa?" Wesley's voice from the rail. He'd appeared at some point and climbed up to balance on the fence, watching. "Go back inside," Everett said. "Is she better?" "She will be." "She was hurting her foot," Wesley said, as a statement rather than a question. "Yes, you fixed it, yes." Wesley seemed satisfied by this. He climbed down from the fence and went back toward the bunkhouse with the calm purpose of someone whose fact-finding mission had been completed. What Everett did not know until he turned to leave the corral was that Vivian had been standing at the rail for the last 3 minutes. He had no idea how long she'd been there. She was very quiet when she chose to be. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read, not gratitude exactly, not suspicion exactly. Something more like the careful evaluation of a person who has learned to be cautious about what she believes. "That's Caraway," she said. "She's worth more than most men I've employed. She's a good animal." He came through the corral gate and latched it behind him. "There's some bruising in the tissue from the stone pressing on it. She'll be tender for a couple days. I wouldn't work her hard. The last 2 hands I asked to look at her said she was fine." He didn't say anything to that. The stone had been lodged in an obvious place if you'd actually looked. But saying so wouldn't help anything. Vivian looked at him for a moment longer. "You've been here one day," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You've fixed a fence line, found a drainage problem I didn't know about, and now this." She paused. "What else did you find that I don't know about?" He thought about the gate latch on the western entrance. He thought about what Carl had said about a second set of ledger books. "The gate latch on the west livestock entry needs replacing," he said, before the hard freeze. Vivian studied him. "Is that all?" "For today," he said. That night, after the boys were asleep, Wesley curled into a ball under 3 blankets with the specific efficiency of a small creature conserving heat. Tobias on his back, with one arm thrown over his face in the pose he'd slept in, since he was 4. Everett sat on the bunkhouse steps with his back against the doorframe and looked at the ranch. It was a cold night, with good stars, the kind of sky that opened up in the high country when the weather cleared. He could see the main house from where he sat, one window still lit on the ground floor. He could see the barn, the stable, the shape of the corral in the dark. He thought about the ledger books Carl had mentioned. He thought about the way Darius had looked at him in the barn that morning. Not just the look of a foreman sizing up an interloper, but something else beneath it. Something that was doing more active work. He thought about Garrett's fork pausing when Dutch had said the word priorities. There was something happening on this ranch beneath the surface of what was visible. He could feel it the way he could feel weather coming, not specific yet, not something he could point to exactly, but present. A wrongness in the air. He hadn't been looking for anyone's problems when he'd ridden through the gate that morning. He'd been looking for work and a roof for his sons. He wasn't sure anymore that those 2 things were going to stay separate. He looked at the lit window in the main house for a while. Then he went inside and shut the bunkhouse door against the cold. The second morning, he fixed the drainage problem near the lower pasture before most of the ranch was awake. It required redirecting a small overflow channel that had silted up over the summer. Not complicated work, but the kind of thing you had to catch before the freeze locked everything in place for winter. He was coming back across the yard when he passed the stable and heard Tobias's voice inside. He stopped. Through the stable wall, he could hear his son talking. Not loud, not at the level of actual conversation, but the low, continued murmur of someone keeping up a gentle and undemanding presence. He recognized the tone, because it was something he'd taught Tobias himself. The way you talked to a frightened horse when you wanted her to understand that you weren't a threat, that your being there had nothing to do with her being afraid. He looked through the stable door. Tobias was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the dark filly's stall. He was not looking at her directly. He was looking at a spot on the straw floor about 2 feet in front of him and talking in that low, soft way, and the filly was standing at the stall gate, not pressed against the far wall, at the gate. She was watching Tobias with one ear forward and one ear half back, which was not calm, exactly, but was measurably less frightened than she'd been the previous morning. Everett watched for about 30 seconds. Then he walked away without saying anything, because some things got worse if you named them. He found the discrepancy in the cattle numbers by accident. Vivian had asked him, on the second afternoon, to carry some supplies to the far pasture replacement salt blocks and a repair kit for a water trough that one of the hands had reported as damaged. He'd taken a horse and a pack mule and done the errand, and while he was working on the trough, he'd counted the cattle in the Samsrandathri pastures out of a pure habit, the way some people counted ceiling beams or steps on a staircase. When he got back to the ranch yard, he went to the main barn and found the tally board that tracked the cattle numbers by pasture. He compared what he'd counted against what the board showed. The board showed 43 head in the west quarter pasture. He'd counted 31. He stood looking at the tally board for a while. Then he checked the south quarter. Board said 67. He hadn't been to the south quarter today, but he'd ridden through it 2 days ago on his way back from the fence line. He remembered counting. He'd counted 52. He had a very good memory for numbers. It was one of the things that had made him useful across 20 years of ranch work. He looked at the tally board for another long moment. Then he went and found Dutch. The cattle numbers on the tally board, he said. How often do you run an actual count? Dutch, who was patching a piece of tack near the barn door, did not immediately look up. Quarterly officially, he said. Last one was July. And in between, foreman updates the board as needed. Based on what? Dutch finally looked up. He looked at Everett with the measured attention of a man doing a specific kind of math. Based on whatever he tells the board it's based on, he said, and looked back at his tack. That evening, Everett asked Vivian if he could speak with her privately. She received him in the main room of the house, which was large and comfortable, and looked like a room where someone had once entertained regularly, and had since stopped. She was sitting near the fire with a ledger book open on her lap. She closed it when he came in. He told her what he'd found. The cattle count discrepancies. The numbers he'd observed in 2 of the pastures against what the tally board showed. The difference between the 2 wasn't explained by natural loss. There'd been no disease reports, no predator activity significant enough to account for 12 head in one pasture, 15 in another. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. What do you think is happening? She said. He thought about Carl's wooden box under Darius's cot. He thought about the way Garrett never quite looked up from his plate. He thought about Darius's walk, the walk of a man who had decided things before he arrived. I think someone's been moving cattle off this ranch, he said. Slowly, carefully enough not to trigger a full count. And I think the tally board is being maintained to hide it. Vivian looked at the ledger in her lap. Then she looked at the fire. Then she looked at him. Darius has managed this ranch for 12 years, she said. I know, he was my husband's foreman. He stayed on after she paused. He knows every acre of this property. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. You've been here 3 days. He held her gaze. I know what I counted. A silence settled between them that had more weight than comfortable. He understood it. He was asking her to weigh 12 years of known history against 3 days of his word. And he was asking her not to just take his word for it, but to consider the possibility that something she had trusted had been working against her. That was not a small ask. I'm not asking you to act on it yet, he said. I'm asking you to look at the actual numbers yourself. Not what the board says. What's actually in the pastures. Vivian looked at the fire. All right, she said finally. I'll ride the south quarter tomorrow. I'd recommend the west quarter too. All right, she said again. He stood, that's all I wanted to say. He was almost to the door when she said, Mr. Clayborne. He turned. Whatever you find out there, she said. Whatever this turns out to be. She paused, and she was choosing her words the way a careful person chooses footing on uncertain ground. Thank you for telling me. He nodded and walked back to the bunkhouse through the cold dark, where his sons were asleep and the stove was holding, and he stood outside for a while and looked at the sky and thought about what was coming. He could feel it now, more than he could feel the weather. Something on Silver Briar was about to break open, and he had a feeling that when it did, it was going to be a great deal worse than a few missing cattle. Vivian rode the south quarter the next morning, before most of the ranch had finished breakfast. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask Darius to accompany her, which was the normal procedure for a property inspection. She saddled her second mare, herself not Caraway, who was still resting her bruised heel, and rode out alone in the gray pre-dawn light, with a tally book tucked inside her coat and a pencil behind her ear. Everett saw her go from the bunkhouse steps where he was drinking his first coffee of the morning. He watched her ride south and disappear into the low fog that had settled overnight along the creek bottom, and he felt the particular tension of a man who has said what he had to say and now has no choice but to wait and see what it costs him. He went to work. He spent the morning on the western gate latch, the one he'd mentioned to Vivian 3 days ago, and that Darius still hadn't assigned anyone to fix. He found the correct hardware in the tool storage, replaced the latch assembly himself, and tested it twice to make sure the mechanism would hold under a hard pull. While he was at it, he checked the gate hinges on both sides and found the left one working loose, so he fixed that too. And by the time he was done, he'd also noticed that the water trough inside the western paddock had a slow seam leak near the base that nobody had caught yet because it was only visible in the morning when the ground was wet enough to show the stain. He patched the seam with the supplies he'd brought back from the far pasture errand. He was putting the tools back when Carl appeared at the paddock gate with 2 mugs of coffee and the expression of a man delivering something other than caffeine. "She came back from the south quarter an hour ago," Carl said, handing Everett a mug. "I figured." She went straight to the office and closed the door. Darius went in 10 minutes later. Carl looked at his own coffee. He was in there about 5 minutes. Came out looking like he'd eaten something bad. Everett drank his coffee. And now? Now Darius is in the stable, working that nervous filly he's been trying to break for 3 weeks. Hard. Carl paused. He works horses hard when he's angry. The hands all know that about him. Everett set his mug down on the paddock fence post. "Which stable?" "South End." He was moving before Carl finished the sentence. The sound reached him before he got to the stable door, the crack of a rope against wood, and the frightened scramble of hooves on the stable floor, and a man's voice. Flat and controlled in the way that's more frightening than shouting, because it means whoever is speaking has decided they're going to win this by outlasting you. Everett came through the stable door. Darius had the filly in the cross ties at the center of the stable aisle, and he was working her with a lunge whip, not making contact with her body, but cracking it close enough that she was flinching sideways every time it snapped and pulling against the ties with her whole body weight. She was soaked with sweat along her neck and flanks. Her eyes had gone to showing white at the rims. Tobias was standing at the far end of the stable aisle, very still, with his back against the wall and his hands at his sides, watching. Darius saw Everett come in. He didn't stop working. "This doesn't concern you. You're making her worse," Everett said. "I've been training horses since before you could walk." "That's not training." Everett came further into the stable, not fast, keeping his movement deliberate. "That's scaring her into compliance. It's not the same thing." Darius finally stopped and turned to face him. The whip was still in his hand. "I suggest you get back to whatever fence you were assigned to and stay out of stable matters." "Nobody assigned me the fence. I found it myself." Everett stopped about 10 feet away. He kept his voice even. "The filly needs to come out of the cross ties." "No." "Darius." The word came from behind both of them. Vivian was standing in the stable doorway. Nobody had heard her come in. She had that quality, the ability to arrive in a space and already be fully present before anyone registered the transition. She was still wearing her riding coat from the morning, and she had her tally book in one hand. "Take her out of the cross ties," Vivian said. Her voice was the same as it always was, level, carrying, not raised. "Put her back in her stall." A moment passed that had too many things inside it. Darius uncrossed the ties. He led the filly to her stall, and the animal walked badly, legs still trembling from the sustained fright, head too high, whole body wound up. He latched the stall door, without speaking, and came back down the aisle. He looked at Vivian. He looked at Everett. He walked out of the stable. The silence he left behind was the kind that has weight. Tobias came away from the wall slowly, like he'd been holding himself rigid for long enough that releasing it took effort. He went to the filly's stall and leaned on the gate and said nothing. Just let her see him there. "You all right?" Everett said quietly to his son. "I was here when he started," Tobias said. "I didn't know what to do." "You stayed," Everett said. "That was right." Vivian looked at the filly for a moment. Then she looked at Tobias, this 9-year-old standing at the stall gate, with his hands wrapped around the bars and his expression older than it should be. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a small movement, like something settling. She left without saying anything further. She came to find Everett that evening in the bunkhouse yard, where he was splitting firewood by the light of a lantern hung on a post. The boys were inside. He could hear them through the thin wall Wesley, talking at a volume that suggested Tobias was not responding with sufficient enthusiasm. Vivian sat on the chopping block stump he'd moved to the side and watched him work for a moment without speaking. "The south quarter," she said finally. "You were right. 49 head. The board says 67. He set down the maul." "And the west quarter?" "I wrote it after I left the office." She looked at her tally book in her hands. 33. Board says 43. He did the math. "That's 28 head unaccounted across 2 pastures." 28, she said. "At current market price, somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 worth of cattle." She said it flatly, in the voice of a woman who has had a few hours to absorb a number and is now dealing with the part that comes after the initial shock. "How long do you think this has been happening?" he said. "I don't know. I've been going through the ledger books from the last 2 years." And she stopped. "The entries are very clean, very consistent, no obvious errors, no corrections. Which, looking at it now, is itself unusual. Ranch accounts always have corrections. Always. Things happen, numbers get adjusted, notes get made. Unless someone is writing them fresh to look like originals." "Yes," she said. Unless that. She was quiet for a moment. The lantern light was uneven, and it made her face harder to read than usual. "I've been thinking about Darius all day," she said. 12 years. He worked this ranch when my husband was alive, and after, and I never had a reason." She stopped again. "I never looked. I trusted the numbers because he gave them to me, and I trusted him." "You couldn't have known without looking," Everett said. "No," she said, "but I could have looked." She set the tally book on her knee. My husband always said, trust is not a substitute for verification." He said it so often I started thinking of it as one of his less interesting habits. She paused. "I should have remembered it more recently." Everett sat on an upturned crate across from her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know where my cattle are going." "I think I know one answer to that," he said. "Harlan Vossick's spread is the only operation large enough to absorb that number without it being visible immediately. His west pastures border your south quarter. The terrain between them is manageable at night," Vivian said. "If you know the fence gaps." She looked at him. Which Darius would know. Yes. She was quiet again, working through something internally that he could see moving behind her eyes but couldn't read the full content of. "I need documentation," she said. "I need numbers I can take to someone with authority. Not what I counted this morning. I need it verified. You need another full count. All pastures. Done independently. Done by someone Darius doesn't control and doesn't know is doing it." She looked at him. "Are you willing?" He thought about Carl, who'd been here 4 years and understood the risk of saying things out loud. He thought about Dutch, who communicated in half-sentences loaded with meaning. He thought about Garrett, who never looked up from his plate. "There are other hands who've known something was wrong," he said. "They haven't said anything because they needed the work and couldn't afford to be wrong." "I know," she said. "If you're going to do this, you need to give them a reason to believe you'll protect them." She looked at him steadily. "I will protect them." He held her gaze for a moment. He believed her. That was the thing. He believed her without a great deal of deliberation, which was unusual for him. He'd spent enough time around people who said true things and people who said convincing things to have developed a fairly reliable sense of the difference. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to Carl tomorrow." And Dutch. "Not Garrett," she said. Something shifted in his attention. "You know about Garrett. I know that Garrett's brother works for Vosek, she said. I've known for a year. I kept meaning to look at whether that connection meant anything. I kept not finding the time. She said it without self-pity, but without absolution either, which he respected. Don't tell Garrett anything. Understood. She stood, tucked the tally book back inside her coat. Mr. Clayborne, Everett, he said. He said it without really planning to. She looked at him. Something passed across her face that was a little wry and a little tired. Everett, she said, be careful how you handle this. He's been here long enough to know things about this ranch that I don't know. That's a kind of power. I know it is. He won't do anything obvious. He's not stupid. No, Everett agreed, he isn't. She walked back toward the main house through the cold dark. He watched her go, and then he picked up the maul again and split the last 3 pieces of firewood and stacked them and went inside to his sons. The next 3 days had the quality of weather building. You could feel the pressure of it without being able to point at a single cloud and say, that one, that's the one that's going to break everything open. Darius was present but careful. He assigned Everett work that kept him away from the cattle, pastures repair jobs on the outbuildings, maintenance on the wagon equipment, 1 full day spent winterizing the pump house near the north well. None of it was unreasonable work. All of it was the kind of work that gave Darius reasons to know exactly where Everett was at every hour of the day. Carl got the message the second morning without Everett having to say much about it. They'd ended up walking the same route to the barn at the same time, and Everett said quietly and without preamble, the cattle numbers. I need a count of the north quarter and the east quarter. Not official. Just what you see. Carl walked for about 4 steps before he answered. I've got a wife and a daughter in Delwood, he said. I know. If this goes bad, Mrs. Lockridge knows what's happening, Everett said. She's the one asking for the count. Another 4 steps. North quarter has 31 head, Carl said. I wrote it last Tuesday. Board says 47. Everett absorbed that. 16 missing from the north quarter. And the east? I haven't been through there recently. Dutch has. Dutch. When Everett found him that afternoon in the equipment barn, communicated his findings in the way he communicated most things obliquely, without appearing to be communicating at all. East quarter's looking thin this season, Dutch said, oiling a saddle without looking up. You'd think the grass got poor out there. How thin? Oh, I'd say it's running about 30 head light of where it ought to be. Everett stood quietly with that number for a moment. That a lot of cattle for the grass to account for, he said. Couldn't say, Dutch said. I'm just a man who knows what he sees. And what do you see? Dutch put the oilcloth down and looked at Everett with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has decided. I see a ranch that's been getting robbed for 2 years by a man who's spent 12 years learning how to do it without getting caught. He paused. And I see a woman who owns that ranch finally starting to look at what she's been too trusting to look at before. Another pause. And I see a man who's been here 2 weeks making it possible for her to look. He picked up the oilcloth and went back to the saddle. You been in Wyoming long? Everett said. Long enough, Dutch said. On the 6th day of Everett's trial week, Wesley got lost. Not seriously lost. Silver Briar wasn't the kind of place where a child could disappear permanently in a single afternoon. But he'd followed a cat that turned out not to be one of the barn cats, but a wilder animal with its own agenda. And he'd ended up in the kitchen garden, and then through a gate he shouldn't have gone through and into the lower orchard. And by the time anyone noticed he was missing, it was late afternoon, and the light was already going flat and gray. Everett found him by the 3rd fence line south of the orchard, sitting on a post and looking at the mountains with the meditative expression of a 6-year-old who has been waiting long enough that he's gotten philosophical about it. I followed a cat, Wesley said, before Everett could say anything. I know. It didn't want to be followed. Cats rarely do. Wesley looked at the mountains for another moment. Is Mrs. Lockridge angry? She's not angry. She looked worried when I could see her from the orchard. Worried is different from angry. Wesley absorbed this distinction. Papa, he said. What? I like it here. Everett didn't say anything. I know we might have to leave, Wesley said, with the particular careful phrasing of a 6-year-old who has been thinking about something for longer than it should take a 6-year-old to think about something. Because the week is almost up. But I like it here. The garden and the horses and Renata. He paused, and Mrs. Lockridge. She showed me how to do the kale properly. Everett picked his younger son up off the fence post and carried him under one arm like a parcel, which Wesley accepted with the dignity of someone who understands that certain ages come with certain indignities. Don't follow cats through unfamiliar gates, Everett said. I'll try, Wesley said, which was the most honest answer he had. When they came back through the lower orchard, Vivian was standing at the orchard gate with her arms crossed and an expression that she managed to keep neutral enough to function as relief rather than panic. Wesley looked at her from his upside-down position under Everett's arm. I followed a cat, he said. I heard, she said. I know where I am now. I can see that. The mountains are very large, Wesley offered as supplementary information. Something in Vivian's expression softened in the way that her expression sometimes did when Wesley was the cause. Not completely, not in a way that made her look soft exactly, but in the way that meant something underneath had moved. She looked at Everett over Wesley's head. He looked back at her. There was a beat of something between them that was simply two adults who had both just experienced the particular fear of a missing child and were now both on the relief side of it. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. Dinner's in 20 minutes, Vivian said. Don't be late. The 7th day, the last day of the trial week, arrived with wind from the northwest and the smell of something heavier coming. Vivian found Everett after the morning work and told him that she wanted him to stay. Permanently, or as permanently as a ranch position could be described. She'd gone through the figures, she said.
She was prepared to offer fair wages and the bunkhouse for him and his boys through winter and into spring.
At which point the arrangements could be revisited. He said yes. He said it the way he said most things, without elaboration, without making it into something larger than it was, but he said it. What he didn't say was that the moment she'd offered it, something in his chest that had been locked up at a particular tension for most of the past year had released, just slightly. Just enough to notice. He went back to work. By that same afternoon, he'd assembled a nearly complete picture of the theft operation across Silver Briar's 6 main pastures. 4 of the 6 were running significantly below the tally board numbers. The total gap was somewhere between 70 and 80 head of cattle gone over what he estimated to be the past 18 to 24 months. That was, conservatively, a loss of $12,000 to $14,000 worth of livestock. And it was still ongoing. He knew this because Carl, who had been quietly watching things he'd previously made a point of not watching, reported that he'd seen Garrett riding the south fence line after dark 2 nights ago. There was no work reason for it. The south fence was the one that bordered Vossick's property. Everett sat with that information for a day before he decided what to do with it. He went back to Vivian. This time she received him in the kitchen, not the main room, because Renata had gone to visit her sister in town, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house at that hour. Vivian was at the table with the official ranch ledger, the one from the office, the one Darius maintained open in front of her. And she'd been going through it, line by line with a pencil behind her ear, and a separate piece of paper for her own notes. And she had the look of a woman who has been at this particular task long enough to start making errors from fatigue. Sit down, she said without looking up. Then, as if she'd heard how that sounded, she added, please. He sat. Garrett rode the south fence line after dark, he said. Carl saw him. Vivian's pencil stopped. He's the one communicating the timing to Vossick, Everett said. Darius plans it. Garrett signals when it's clear to move. She put the pencil down flat on the table. She looked at it rather than at him for a moment. I hired Garrett 4 years ago, she said. He came with good references. From where? A pause. From Vossick, actually, she said. One of Vossick's former associates. She said it with the slow sound of someone hearing a thing they'd known separately finally connect. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Vossick wasn't a problem then. He was just a neighbor. When did that change? About 2.5 years ago, she said. He started making offers on the south grazing land. Reasonable offers at first, then less reasonable when I said no. Then he stopped asking directly and started being present in ways that were harder to object to. She paused. There were other men too, businessmen from Cheyenne. 2 of them showed up inside of 6 months with the same proposal, almost word for word, which at the time I thought was coincidence. It wasn't coincidence. No, she said. No, it probably wasn't. She looked at the ledger. If Vosick can make Silver Briar appear financially struggling, if the cattle numbers are low, if the accounts show losses, then a sale starts looking necessary rather than just attractive. And he can offer less than fair value because I'd appear to need the cash. She paused again. And if I'm a widow without partners or advisors, who can verify what I'm being told about my own ranch's numbers? It works, Everett said. It almost worked, she said. Would have worked probably by spring. If I'd made it through winter thinking I was running lower numbers than I was and the accounts kept showing losses. She stopped. She did not complete that sentence, but he could hear the shape of what was in it, the desperation that would have arrived by March, the kind of desperation that makes a person accept terms they would never accept otherwise. They sat in the kitchen in the quiet of the house, and neither of them spoke for a while. What do you want to do? He said finally. Same question as before. Same answer, she said. I want documentation. I want numbers, dates, witnesses. I want something solid enough that it can't be argued away by a man who's been here 12 years and has built up 12 years of people who'll say he's honest. She looked at him. And I want to understand how they're moving the cattle across the south fence without anyone seeing it. I can ride that fence line tonight, he said. Find the crossing points. I'm coming. You don't need to. It's my ranch, she said. I'm coming. He looked at her for a moment, the fatigue around her eyes, the set of her jaw, the pencil-marked paper full of numbers she'd been working through for hours. Tobias can watch Wesley, he said. He's done it before. I know, she said. I'll meet you at the south barn at 10 o'clock. They rode out in cold moonlight, moving slow and staying off the ridge lines, where their silhouettes would show against the sky. Vivian knew the south quarter the way people know land they grew up working. Not from memory exactly, but from something deeper than that. Some combination of memory and body that meant she turned before he did at the creek crossing and knew without checking which of the old boundary markers had been moved. They found the first crossing point about 1.5 miles south of the main yard, in a low section of the fence where the terrain dipped into a shallow draw. The bottom 2 wires had been loosened from their posts in a way that looked, from a distance, like natural sag. But up close you could see that the staples on 2 posts had been deliberately backed out and replaced with softer wire loops, the kind that could be unhooked quickly in the dark and rehooked just as fast, leaving no obvious trace. Vivian crouched down and looked at the wire closely. How long, she said. He crouched beside her, 6 months at least. The loops have been bent and rebent enough times that the wires fatigued at the bending point. He paused. Probably longer. She straightened up and looked south toward where Vosick's fence line would be in the dark. How far is his property from here? About 300 yards through the draw. There's a tree line, then open ground. You could move a dozen head through here in an hour if you knew what you were doing. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground around the post. There were marks in the soft earth, partial hoof impressions, multiple overlapping, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Multiple trips, she said. Yes. She pulled out a small notebook from her coat and wrote something down in the dark. He couldn't see what she was writing, but he could hear the deliberate movement of the pencil. They found 2 more crossing points before midnight one, near the old creek bed crossing that had gone dry 2 summers ago. One at the southeast corner where the fence curved along a rock formation that blocked the sightlines from the main ranch. Both showed the same modification, loosened staples, easy-release wire loops, and the accumulated ground marks of repeated passage. By the time they rode back toward the main yard, the cloud cover that had been building all evening had thickened enough to drop the temperature another 5 degrees and put a hard edge on the wind. 3 crossing points, Vivian said, as they walked the horses back toward the south barn. All of them prepared over months, all of them undetectable unless you went looking. Darius went looking, Everett said, just not in the way you'd want. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It had too much bitterness in it. He was my husband's choice, she said. Edward trusted him completely. After Edward died, I trusted him completely because Edward had. She paused. I thought that was loyalty. It probably was. Once. And then it stopped being. That happens to people, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Did someone do that to you? Trust you. And then she stopped. I'm sorry. That's not my business. No, he said. It's all right. He thought about it. My wife died 4 years ago. Before she was sick, we had a place in Colorado. Not much, a small spread, but it was ours. After she died, I tried to hold on to it and couldn't. The man I'd borrowed against it from a man I'd considered honest. He called the note early. Gave me 60 days. He paused. I later found out he'd been waiting for exactly that situation. That he'd planned on it. She rode beside him in silence for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago. It wasn't exactly 4 years wasn't long when you still woke up in unfamiliar places reaching for things that weren't there. But it was what you said. Is that why you don't want charity? She said. It was a direct question. He expected her to soften it, and she didn't. I don't want to owe anyone for the wrong reasons, he said. Owing a man who's honest is a debt you can live with. Owing someone who's waiting for your weak moment. He didn't finish that. You think I might be that kind of person, she said. No, he said. He said it without hesitation, and realized after he'd said it that the lack of hesitation meant something. I don't think that. She didn't respond to that directly. They rode into the south barnyard and dismounted, and she held both horses while he opened the barn door, which was a practical arrangement. He was closer to the door, but also the kind of small moment that happens between people who have started to move around each other without bumping. He unsaddled her mare first, then his own horse. Darius is going to know we went out tonight, she said, from the barn doorway. Probably. He'll move faster. Whatever he was planning for winter, he'll try to move it forward. I know, we need to be faster. I know that too. He hung the tack. How long to get territorial authorities involved? A sheriff, or Sheriff Bates in Delwood is a good man, she said. But he'll want documentation, not just my word and yours. He'll want a formal count, written records, witnesses willing to testify. She paused. That takes time. A week if we push. More if Darius does anything to complicate it. Then we start tomorrow, Everett said. First light. She nodded. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and looked at him across the barn in the lantern light. You've been here 9 days, she said. Yes. And you found all of this. The cattle numbers, anyone would have found if they'd counted. The fence modifications, same thing if you rode the line. But nobody did, she said. For 2 years, nobody did. He didn't have anything useful to say to that, so he said nothing. Why, she said. It was a real question, not rhetorical. You could have kept quiet about it, done your week, collected your wages, moved on. It wasn't your problem. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about Wesley saying, I like it here with the tone of a child who had stopped expecting places to like him back. He thought about Tobias on an upturned bucket, outside a frightened horse's stall, still there after 40 minutes, not because anyone told him to be, but because it was the right thing to do. I don't know how to see a wrong thing and not say so, he said. My father was the same way. It caused him more trouble than it was worth about half the time. She looked at him steadily. And the other half? He almost smiled. He said it was worth it. She walked out of the barn into the cold night. He heard her footsteps going toward the main house, and then the sound of the house door. He latched the barn, and he stood in the yard for a minute, listening to the wind in the fence wire, and he thought about 2 years of careful and patient theft, and about a woman who had been left alone with more money than protection and trusted the wrong people because she had no reason not to, and about how that was not a character flaw so much as it was a fact of what isolation did to a person's judgment. And he thought about the weather smell in the wind, that particular iron and ice quality that Wyoming air got about 48 hours before something serious arrived. Whatever Darius was going to do, he was going to do it soon. Everett walked back to the bunkhouse and put more wood in the stove and checked on his boys. Wesley had migrated across the cot in his sleep until he was hanging half off the edge, which was a nightly occurrence that defied explanation. Everett moved him back to center without waking him. Tobias opened one eye. Everything okay? Yes, Everett said. Tobias closed his eye. He was asleep again in 30 seconds. Everett sat on the edge of his own cot in the dark and listened to the wind against the bunkhouse walls and thought about the crossing points in the fence and the loosened wire and the accumulated hoof marks in the soft earth and what a man with 12 years of knowledge and a plan already in motion might do when he realized the clock had run out. He didn't sleep for a long time, and when he did, it was with his boots still on. The snow started before dawn, not a gentle beginning, not the soft preliminary flakes that sometimes arrived ahead of a real storm like a polite warning. This came sideways, driven by the northwest wind that had been building since the night before, and by the time Everett stepped outside at first light, there was already 4 inches on the ground, and the sky was the color of something solid. He stood in the bunkhouse doorway and looked at it and felt his stomach drop. Not because of the snow itself. He'd worked through Wyoming winters before, and he knew what a horse and a good coat could manage. What dropped his stomach was the timing, the particular wrongness of a storm arriving right now. When Vivian had documents spread across her office desk, and Carl and Dutch had both agreed to put their names to a formal count, and the messenger to Sheriff Bates in Delwood was supposed to ride out this morning. Nobody was riding to Delwood in this. He went back inside and built up the stove and let the boys sleep another hour while he sat at the small table and thought about what Darius would do with an extra day. A man who knew he was running out of time and suddenly found himself handed 24 hours of cover, that was a dangerous calculation. When Tobias woke up, he looked at the white outside the bunkhouse window and said nothing for a moment. Then how bad? Bad enough. What do we need to do? Everett looked at his son 9 years old, already asking the right question before he'd eaten breakfast. Stay close to the main house today. Keep Wesley with you. Tobias understood the second part of that instruction without being told the first part, which was that this wasn't about weather. The ranch woke up slow and tight, the way operations did under a serious storm, everyone, moving with the compressed purpose of people who know there's too much to do and not enough daylight to do it in. The cattle in the outer pastures needed checking. The horses needed additional feed. The water troughs had to be broken free of ice before they froze solid. Every hand was occupied, and Darius moved through the yard assigning tasks with the brisk efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, which was precisely the problem. Everett watched him from across the yard while he was leading his mare out for the morning check. Darius moved like a man who had already decided something. There was a quality to him, not rushed, not anxious, but with a finality in every action, the look of someone performing a last performance. 12 years of learning Silver Briar's rhythms had given him the ability to look occupied and purposeful while doing something else entirely. Garrett was saddled and out before most hands were done with breakfast. "Where's he going?" Everett said to Carl quietly as they crossed paths near the east barn. Carl glanced toward where Garrett had disappeared into the white. Darius sent him to check the south pasture fence line, he said. Because of the storm. It was a perfectly reasonable assignment. That was the problem with it. "Which section?" Everett said. Carl met his eyes. He didn't say. Everett finished checking his mare's feet and saddled her and went to find Vivian. She was in the office, still in her work clothes from the previous night, which meant she'd slept in the chair or not at all. The desk was covered in the ranch ledger, her own notes, and 3 years of quarterly cattle reports she'd apparently pulled from the filing cabinet and spread out in rough chronological order. She had a line of pencil marks running down the margin of one page that looked like a timeline. "Storm's going to last through the night," Everett said, closing the office door behind him. "I know. Garrett rode south 10 minutes ago. Darius sent him to check the fence line." Vivian looked up from the papers. "He's signaling tonight," Everett said. "He's going to use the storm as cover to move the remaining herd. By morning, whatever cattle he's planning to transfer will be on Vossick's land. The crossing points will be re-stapled and look clean, and the storm will have erased the ground tracks." She was already on her feet, reaching for her coat on the wall hook. "How many head is he likely to move? Depends on how nervous he is. Could be 20. Could be everything still in the south quarter. That's 33 animals, yes." She was buttoning her coat with the focused speed of someone running a calculation in their head. "If he moves them tonight and we can't produce a current count as evidence, then the board numbers become the only record," Everett said. "And the board says what Darius wrote." She stopped buttoning for exactly 1 second. That 1 second was the full extent of what she allowed herself before she continued. "We need witnesses at the south fence tonight. We need more than witnesses. We need to catch him in the act, or we need the cattle back on this side of the line before morning." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" He thought about the crossing points they'd found 2 nights ago, the layout of the draw, the distance to Vasik's fence line, the number of horses he'd need, and the number of hands he could trust. Carl and Dutch, he said. Those are the only 2 I'm certain of. 3 men, and you, 4, she said, and whatever advantage the terrain gives us. It wasn't much. He knew it and she knew it. But the alternative was letting it happen and having nothing to show for it in the morning except her word against 12 years of Darius Blackwell's. Tonight, she said, after supper. Darius won't move before full dark. He'll move late, Everett agreed. Storm like this, he'll want maximum cover. Probably around midnight. Then we're in position by 10. She looked at him once more with the steady, level look she used when she'd committed to something. Don't tell anyone else. Not even Renata. Understood. He turned to go. Everett, he turned back. Your boys, she said. They stay in the main house tonight. Inside door bolted. He looked at her for a moment. You think it'll go that far? I think Darius has been planning this for 2 years, she said. And I think a man who's planned something for that long doesn't give it up without a fight. She paused. I want your sons inside, he nodded. I'll tell Tobias. The day ground on under the weight of the storm. The snow didn't let up and the wind didn't ease, and by noon the yard was drifted enough that moving between buildings required effort. Everett worked alongside the other hands broke ice on 3 troughs, helped move a group of horses from the outer paddock to the covered run near the main stable, repaired a gate latch that the wind had worked open overnight. He worked where Darius could see him working. That was deliberate. A man who thinks you don't know what he's planning is a man who makes predictable choices. Darius moved through the storm day with his performance of normalcy intact. He gave orders. He checked in with each task. He stopped by the bunkhouse at mid-afternoon to inspect the repairs Everett had done to the stovepipe, something he'd never shown interest in before, and stood in the doorway, for a moment looking at the interior of the building, with the particular gaze of a man confirming the location of things. Storm's going to be hard tonight, Darius said. Looks that way, Everett said. Best stay put after supper. No point riding out in this. No point at all, Everett agreed. Darius left. Everett watched him walk back across the yard toward the Fairlands and thought about the wooden box under the cot that Carl had mentioned in the first week. The second set of ledger books. He hadn't moved on that information yet because he hadn't needed to. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything that could be used would need to be used. At 4 in the afternoon, while the storm hammered at the windows, and Renata was making an enormous pot of venison stew that filled the main house with steam and the smell of something warm, Wesley appeared at Vivian's office door. He did not knock. He rarely knocked. He appeared in doorways the way weather appeared preceded by a change in the atmosphere. Vivian was at her desk with her papers, and she looked up, and there was Wesley in his oversized coat with a look on his face that meant he had been thinking about something for long enough that he needed to say it. Are you worried? He said. I'm working, she said. That's not the same as no. She looked at him for a moment. He was 6 years old, and he stood in her office doorway with the unblinking directness of someone who has had no patience trained into them yet. And she thought, not for the first time, that whoever his father had been before the Colorado ranch and the dead wife and the years of sleeping in barns, he must have been a man worth knowing. A little worried, she said. Yes. Wesley nodded as if this confirmed something. My papa fixes things, he said. He's good at it. He fixed the stovepipe and the fence and the water trough and the mare's foot. He paused. He'll fix whatever this is, too. She looked at this child who had just delivered the most unsentimental vote of confidence she'd ever received, and she said, I hope so, Wesley. You should hope so more than that, he said, with the tone of someone correcting a small but significant error, and he left. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to her papers. Tobias found out at supper, not because Everett told him everything. He didn't and wouldn't. But Tobias had been 9 years of age for exactly 3 months, and in those 9 years, he had developed the particular sensitivity of a child who has spent too long watching adults manage things they were trying to hide from him. He watched his father eat supper with the kind of focused attention that meant Everett wasn't actually tasting his food. He watched Carl eat quickly and keep his eyes on his plate. He watched Dutch eat slowly and steadily, which was Dutch's normal pace, but with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. He watched Darius, across the room, eat heartily and talk to the two hands beside him about the storm and its likely duration, and the cattle losses they might expect from the cold. After supper, when Everett walked the boys to the main house to leave them with Renata, Tobias pulled back at the door and said quietly, "Something's happening tonight." Everett looked at his son. "I'm not asking to come," Tobias said, which was its own remarkable sentence from a 9-year-old. "I just want to know you know what you're doing." "I know what I'm doing," Everett said. "And Mrs. Lockridge?" "She's with me." Tobias stood in the doorway of the main house with the cold at his back and thought about that for a moment. "She's good on a horse," he said finally. He said it the way he evaluated things he had observed directly and considered relevant. "I know," Everett said. "Okay." Tobias went inside. Everett stood at the door for a moment after it closed. Then he went back out into the snow. By 9:30, the storm was operating at full authority. The wind had picked up to the point where it was difficult to hear anything beyond the immediate radius of your own body, and the snow was horizontal in the gusts. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet in the open. Everett met Vivian, Carl, and Dutch at the south barn as planned. They saddled in silence, working fast and without extra movement. Vivian had her father's old canvas storm coat over everything else, and she had her rifle in the saddle scabbard, which Everett noted without commenting on. Carl had a lantern, but they couldn't use it until they were far enough south that it wouldn't be visible from the yard. Dutch had rope. "We split here," Everett said, his voice raised just enough to carry over the wind. "Carl, you take the east crossing point, the one near the dry creek bed. Dutch, you take the southeast corner. Mrs. Lockridge and I will take the main draw. If they're moving animals, they'll use the draw," Dutch said. "Most cover. That's why we'll be there first." He looked at each of them. "Nobody moves alone. If you see activity, you wait. We need them on this side of the fence or caught in the act. If they get the cattle across to Vossick's land before we can act." "They won't," Vivian said. It was not optimism. It was a decision. They rode out into the white dark. The draw was worse in the storm than it had been 2 nights ago. The terrain that made it useful for moving cattle at night, the way the land dipped and the tree line provided windbreak also, turned it into a wind tunnel when the northwest gust found the right angle. Everett rode with his face down against his horse's neck for the worst stretches. Vivian rode beside him without complaint. They positioned themselves above the main crossing point, in the tree line about 40 feet back from the fence, where they had a sight line down into the draw, but could not themselves be easily seen. They tied the horses to the tree line and settled in. The cold was extraordinary. The kind of cold that came not just from temperature, but from sustained wind, driving moisture through every layer of clothing, the kind that made your face feel like something separate from your body after the first hour. Vivian sat beside him on a fallen tree trunk, with her storm coat pulled tight and her hat pulled down, and did not, as far as he could tell, make a single sound of complaint. "You're going to be frozen solid by midnight," he said. "So are you," she said. "I'm used to it." "People keep saying that as if used to it means it doesn't affect you," she said. "It still affects you. You've just stopped expecting it not to." He thought about that. Fair enough. They waited. The snow moved in curtains. Sometimes visibility opened up to 40 or 50 feet, and he could see down the draw clearly, and then a gust would come and close everything back down to near nothing. An hour passed, then another. At 11:40 by his watch, he had to hold it up close to his face in the dark to read it. Vivian said very quietly, "There." He heard it before he saw it. The sound that cattle make when they're being moved against their preference in bad weather. Not the usual low-settled sound, but a tighter, reluctant sound. Animals communicating discomfort to each other and being pushed forward regardless. It came from the north, from the direction of the south quarter pasture. Then shapes appeared in the draw below them. Cattle moving south in a loose group, not panicked, not running, but moving steadily, driven by 2 riders on either side. In the dark and snow, he couldn't get a full count, but it was significant. 20 head at least, more coming behind them. He could see Garrett on the right flank, his silhouette recognizable by the horse. He couldn't see Darius yet. Then, a 3rd rider appeared at the rear, driving stragglers, and even in the darkened distance, there was something in the rider's posture, the way he sat a horse, that made Everett certain. Vivian was on her feet. "Not yet," he said, low, controlled. "When?" when they're at the fence, when they touch that wire. He needed them at the modification point, physically present at the evidence. The cattle moved down into the draw, and the sound of them grew, and the riders moved with them, working the flanks. Everett watched Darius ride to the fence and dismount, and he watched him work the wire at the main crossing point, with the fast, familiar movements of a man who had done this many times. And he watched the first cattle push through the loosened bottom wires toward Vossick's land. Now, Everett said. He was out of the tree line, and moving before the word was fully out. Vivian went right. He went left, coming down the draw slope toward the fence. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard as he rode, not to threaten, but to be visible. A rider with a rifle appearing out of a blizzard in the dark was a message that communicated faster than words. Darius Blackwell. His voice went hard into the wind. Get away from that fence. Everything happened at once. Garrett wheeled his horse and broke south toward Vossick's land. He was through the fence gap before Everett could cut him off, pushing his horse hard into the dark on the other side, abandoning everything and running. Darius didn't run. That was the thing about Darius, he didn't panic. He stood at the fence and turned slowly and looked at Everett coming down the draw slope on horseback, and then he looked at Vivian coming from the other direction, and he made a fast calculation. Then he went for the cattle, not to stop them from crossing, to push them faster, to drive as many as possible through the gap to Vossick's land before anyone could stop him, because a cattle movement already half completed was harder to undo than one that hadn't started. He hit the rear of the herd with his rope, hard, driving them south through the gap, and the startled animals lunged and pushed. And in 30 seconds he'd pushed another 8 or 10 head through the crossing before Everett got between him and the herd. Stop, Everett said. Darius looked at him across the backs of the cattle. You got nothing, Darius said. His voice was flat. You got a witness count of cattle in bad visibility in the middle of a blizzard. I'll say I was checking the fence. I'll say the wire was already loose. He paused. And I'll say this new hand, this drifter you took in 9 days ago, was the one who opened it, looking to make himself useful by creating a problem he could solve. The audacity of it landed like something physical. Vivian came up on the other side and stopped her horse. She was looking at Darius with an expression Everett hadn't seen on her before, not fury, which he might have expected. Something colder than fury, the face of a woman who has been making calculations and has arrived at a final sum. Get off my land, she said, Mrs. Lockridge. Get off Silver Briar. Tonight. In this storm or in the morning, I don't care. But you are done here. You can't have your second ledger books, she said. Complete silence from Darius for the first time. The wooden box under your cot, she said. I went through your quarters this afternoon while you were at the North Barn. I have the books, Darius. 2 years of the actual numbers, the real movements, the real dates, the names of the buyers Vossick arranged. Your own handwriting. She paused. Would you like to continue telling me what I can't prove? Something happened in Darius's face that Everett had never seen there before. Not remorse. He wasn't built for it. But something like the specific deflation of a man whose plan has just failed in the one place he was certain it couldn't fail. He looked at the cattle on both sides of the fence. He looked at the loosened wire. He looked at Vivian in her storm coat with her father's rifle in her scabbard and her voice level enough to cut through a Wyoming blizzard. I built this ranch, he said. Your husband couldn't have kept it running without me. After he died, I held it together. You don't understand what it takes. I understand exactly what it takes, she said. I've been learning it a great deal faster than you expected. She looked at him steadily. Carl materialized from the north edge of the draw. He'd followed them down after hearing the confrontation start. He stopped his horse between Darius and the north pasture. Dutch has the southeast corner, Everett said, to nobody in particular. Garrett ran. He went south onto Vossick's land. Garrett will keep running, Darius said, and there was something in the way he said it, almost a dismissal, that suggested Garrett had always been the most expendable part of the arrangement. Get down from your horse, Everett said. You don't have the authority. I'm giving you the option, Everett said. The other option is that you stay on that horse and I follow you wherever you go tonight, in this storm, until you don't have anywhere else to be. Your choice. Darius looked at him for a long moment. Then he dismounted, They got him back to the main ranch yard by 1 in the morning. Dutch arrived at the south barn 20 minutes behind them, reported that the southeast crossing point was clear. No movement, no Garrett, and helped settle the recovered cattle into the east paddock, which was the closest covered shelter with space, enough to hold them temporarily. The final count, done by lantern light in the driving snow, was 19 head recovered. The ones that had crossed to Vossick's side before Everett got between Darius and the herd were gone for the night. 14 animals. 14 animals that were now technically on Vossick's land, with no documentation of the crossing. Vivian stood in the east paddock while Dutch and Carl settled the recovered cattle, and she looked at the paddock count, and Everett could see her running the math. 14, she said. We'll get them back, he said. How? He'd been thinking about that since the draw. The problem with the 14 that had crossed was that by morning Vossick would have had time to move them into his main herd, and once they were mixed with Vossick's cattle, the identification became harder. Not impossible. Silver Briar's brand was clear, but the circumstances of the recovery would be contested, unless the recovery happened before morning. The breeding horses, he said. Vivian turned to look at him. Darius was at the fence personally tonight, Everett said. That's unusual. Normally, he'd have hands do the moving, the way he has before. He was there himself because tonight was the last run. The big one. He paused, working through it. He wasn't just moving cattle. He had something else planned for tonight. The breeding horses, Vivian said, and her voice was very flat. If he moves the breeding stock to Vossick's operation, that's not just a financial loss. That's the foundation of Silver Briar's breeding program. 5-6 years of selective development. She was already moving toward the stable. Everett went after her. They came through the stable door, and Vivian went down the row of stalls, checking each one, counting, looking, and at the far end of the stable, where the 5 premier breeding mares were housed in the larger stalls, she stopped. 2 empty. She turned and looked at him, and in the lantern light her expression had the particular quality of a person absorbing a blow they should have anticipated. He sent someone ahead, she said, while we were in the draw. He was already thinking about who. Garrett had run south. Darius had been at the fence. There was one name that settled into place, with the cold logic of pieces fitting. The third rider, he said, at the rear of the herd. I thought it was Darius, but I couldn't be certain in the dark. 2 riders working the herd, she said, Darius and someone else. And a third person who came here. They didn't know who. They knew it didn't matter in this moment, because every minute they stood in the stable was another minute the horses were moving toward Vossick's property in a blizzard. And horses in a blizzard could travel faster than cattle, and could be moved into Vossick's covered stable and vanished into his operation before dawn. Where would they take them? Everett said. Vossick's property nearest covered stable to the south fence. About 1.5 miles, she said. There's an old line station Vossick converted to a stable about 3 years ago. It's his closest structure to our boundary. 1.5 miles in a blizzard on a dark night. Possible, barely. I'll go, he said. You don't know Vossick's land. No, I do. She was already moving to the tack room. I grew up riding this entire territory. I know where that line station is. Vivian. He said her name, not Mrs. Lockridge, and it stopped her for exactly a beat. These are Vossick's people on his land. If they've been planning this, miss. I know, she said. She came back with a bridle in her hand and looked at him directly. I know what could happen. I'm coming anyway. A pause. Those mares are the future of this ranch, not just the money. The breeding program my husband started. 5 years of work. She paused again. I'm coming. He didn't have anything left to argue with, because he'd already used the only real argument and she'd answered it. Caraway, he said. She's the fastest you have that we can trust in this. It's been 4 days. She'll be sound enough for tonight. He paused. We go fast and we go quiet. We get to the line station before whoever is moving those horses does. He saddled Caraway himself while Vivian saddled his mare. They didn't speak while they worked. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and animals, and the kind of particular quiet that exists inside a shelter when a storm is happening outside it. And Everett was aware of all of it, with the heightened attention that came from knowing the next 2 hours would determine whether the last 9 days had meant anything at all. He had a thought, brief and unwelcome, about Tobias and Wesley in the main house. Bolted door. Renata with them. He held the thought for 2 seconds and then put it away, because there was no version of tonight where he could be in 2 places. They rode south into the blizzard. Caraway moved through the storm with the grim professionalism of a good horse who has been asked to do a hard thing by someone she trusts, not happy about it, not pretending otherwise, but moving. She had speed even in the snow, and Vivian rode her with the particular ease of a person who has been on this animal's back enough times that they'd worked out a shared language. Everett rode beside them, slightly behind, letting Vivian navigate. She moved through the storm with a certainty that came from knowing the land under the snow, the shapes of it, the slopes, the ways the terrain told you where you were, even when you couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. They hit Vossick's fence line in 20 minutes, faster than he'd expected. Vivian found a gate, a proper gate, not a modified crossing, and it wasn't locked, which told him something about how confident Vossick had been about not being followed tonight. She opened it and they went through. The line station was another quarter-mile south. No lights visible from outside, which could mean empty or could mean shuttered. They dismounted before they reached it and walked the last 100 yards, leading the horses. Everett heard the sound first. The movement of horses inside a closed structure, the particular restless energy of animals that have been put somewhere unfamiliar in bad weather and are unhappy about it. He held up a hand and Vivian stopped. There was a lantern light coming from underneath the station door. A thin line of it, 1 person inside, maybe 2. He thought about what he had, the element of surprise, the fact that whoever was in that building expected to be alone for hours yet, and the truth that a person caught with branded horses in the middle of the night had very few places to stand. He went to the station door and knocked on it, not loud, not demanding, just knocked, the way a person knocks when they've arrived somewhere they belong. A pause inside. Shuffling movement, the door opened. It was a young hand Everett barely knew, a recent hire named Weston, barely 20, who'd been on Silver Briar for 6 weeks, and who looked at Everett in the doorway of the line station with the expression of a person whose entire understanding of the next several years of his life has just restructured itself in the time it takes a door to swing open. Behind him, in the lantern light, were Silver Briar's 2 breeding mares, cross-tied in the narrow space and looking profoundly unhappy about it. Weston looked at Everett. He looked at Vivian, who had come around to stand behind Everett and who was looking at him with the steady, unbothered expression of a woman who is very tired and very certain and has no patience left for anything that isn't the truth. "Darius paid me $50, Weston said. He said it immediately, without being asked, with the desperate velocity of a young man trying to outrun the thing he'd done before it fully arrived. He said it was a transfer. He said she'd authorized it. He said, 'Where are the lead ropes?' Vivian said. Weston pointed. 'Take them down,' she said. 'And then you're going to walk back to Silver Briar in the snow, and you're going to tell Dutch everything Darius told you, every word of it, and you're going to write it down with your name on it.' She paused. 'If you do that, I'll tell Sheriff Bates you cooperated. If you don't,' she let that end where it was. Weston took down the lead ropes. They brought the mares back through the storm on lead lines, moving carefully, and by the time they came back through Silver Briar's south gate, the wind had dropped slightly. Not gone, but less punishing, and the snow had shifted from horizontal to a steeper angle that meant the worst of it had passed the peak. Everett led both mares into the stable and got them settled. Caraway went back into her stall without argument. He checked her heel warm but not hot, which was about as good as he could have hoped for. He came back out to the stable aisle, and Vivian was sitting on a tack trunk with her hat in her hands and her coat open, and she was just sitting there, not moving. He had never seen her sit like that before. She always had the posture of someone who expected to have to stand up quickly. He sat on the trunk across the aisle. For a while, neither of them said anything. The stable was warm. The storm moved against the roof. The horses made the sounds horses make when they are safe and still. "You went through his quarters this afternoon," Everett said finally. "Yes. You knew you were going to confront him tonight." "I suspected," she said. The storm made it almost certain. It was too useful to him to waste. She paused. "I found the box exactly where Carl said it would be." The books were stopped. 2 years. He was very careful, very precise. She looked at her hands. He thought he was going to retire on Vossick's money. He thought he was going to watch me sell this ranch at a loss and use his share to buy something small and comfortable somewhere else. He almost managed it. He almost managed it, she said. 10 more days and the storm would have come and gone, and the cattle would have been on Vossick's land, and the accounts would have shown a bad year. And I would have been standing here trying to explain to myself why the numbers didn't add up and not being able to. She looked at him. If you hadn't come through that gate, you would have found it eventually. Maybe. She didn't say it with certainty, which was one of the things about her that he'd come to recognize. She didn't claim more confidence than she actually had. Maybe not in time. The wind shifted outside, and a gust hit the stable roof and then settled. My boys, Everett said. They're safe, she said. I checked on them an hour ago when I went to get the ledger books. Renata was with them. They were asleep. A pause. Wesley was half off the cot. He almost smiled. He does that. Every night, every night. She looked at her hat in her hands. She turned it over once. You told me this afternoon that you fix things, she said. He mentioned he talked to you. He was very serious about it. She paused. He's 6 years old. He was born serious. Tobias is different. Tobias is Tobias carries things, Everett said. He carries more than he should for his age. He paused. He'll be all right. He's got good instincts. Vivian was quiet for a moment. I don't know anything about children, she said. I should probably tell you that. They don't need you to know things about children, she said. They just need... He stopped. That was a sentence with a direction he hadn't intended to walk, and he let it end where it was. She looked at him. He looked at the stable floor. We should get some sleep, he said. We've got a long day coming. Sheriff Bates, the formal count, the documentations. I know, she said. She stood up, put her hat back on, buttoned her coat. Everett. She said his name the way she'd been saying it since the second week, naturally, without the formality that had been there at the start. What you did tonight, you didn't have to. This isn't your ranch. I know it isn't. You risked, I know what I risked. He stood. It was worth it. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd never fully learned to read, the one that had more going on in it than she ever said out loud. Then she walked out of the stable into the lessening storm, and he watched her cross the yard toward the lit windows of the main house. He stayed in the stable for a while longer. He didn't particularly want to examine why. He checked each horse one more time, the way he did every night stall by stall, unhurried, making sure everything was settled. When he got to the dark filly's stall, the nervous one, the one Darius had terrified repeatedly with the lunge whip, he found Tobias. His son was asleep on an upturned bucket outside the stall, his back against the wall and his chin on his chest, with his coat wrapped around him. Inside the stall, the filly was standing at the gate, not in the back corner, not with her ears flat, at the gate, watching the sleeping boy with both ears forward. Everett looked at that for a long moment. He lifted Tobias gently off the bucket. The boy stirred but didn't fully wake, made a sound, settled, and carried him out of the stable across the yard and back into the bunkhouse, where Wesley was indeed half off his cot. And he laid Tobias down and moved Wesley back to center and stood in the bunkhouse in the dark and looked at his sleeping sons. Outside, the storm was easing. The wind had dropped to something manageable. He could hear the cattle in the east paddock settling into the familiar sounds of animals that have been frightened and are gradually becoming less so. He sat on the edge of his cot and took his boots off this time. He thought about 14 cattle still on Vossick's land that would need legal recovery. He thought about Weston's written statement and Darius's ledger books and the crossing points in the south fence, and what Sheriff Bates would make of all of it. He thought about the long, exhausting, documented process that was coming, the kind of justice that moved on paperwork and witness testimony and cold facts rather than on anything fast or dramatic. He thought about Vivian sitting on a tack trunk with her hat in her hands. He lay back. The snow settled on Silver Briar's roof, and the quiet that comes after a storm finally decides it's finished. Sheriff Bates arrived at Silver Briar 2 days after the storm. He came with a deputy and a territorial land agent named Foswick, who had the particular look of a man who spent most of his professional life dealing with situations that were more complicated than they should have been, and had developed a permanent expression of preemptive exhaustion as a result. They rode in mid-morning when the sky had cleared to a hard, bright blue, and the snow on the ground was crusting over with a particular crunch that meant the temperature had dropped further overnight. Everett watched them come through the gate from the east barn where he was working, and he felt something in his chest release that he hadn't fully registered was tight. Vivian received them in the main house. She had spent the previous 2 days in a state of controlled and comprehensive preparation that he had watched with a kind of quiet respect, organizing the ledger books. Weston's written statement, her own documented cattle counts, the sketched maps of the 3 fence crossing points, with their measurements and hardware modifications described in her careful handwriting. She had written everything twice, once for legibility, once as a backup copy that she kept in a separate location in the house. She had also, quietly and without announcement, sent word to 3 neighboring ranchers whose land bordered Silver Briar on the north, and East Sidesmen who had known her husband, who had watched the ranch operate for years, who had their own reasons to be interested in what Harlan Vosick had been doing, with a foreman and a compliant cattle operation next door. 2 of those ranchers arrived the same morning as Sheriff Bates, which was not a coincidence. Everett understood, watching this unfold, that Vivian Lockridge had not been simply reacting to events since the night of the storm. She had been building something, methodically, the way she did most things quietly, without announcing the shape of it until it was already too far along to dismantle. Darius had spent the 2 days since the storm in the bunkhouse, under what was functionally house arrest, though nobody called it that. Carl and Dutch took turns making sure he didn't leave the property. He had tried once, on the morning after the storm, and Carl had simply ridden to block the gate without a word, and Darius had looked at him for a long moment and turned back. He knew what was coming. He had known it from the moment Vivian had said the words "wooden box" in the draw in the blizzard, with the snow coming sideways and his plan dissolving in real time around him. A man who has spent 2 years building a careful deception recognizes, with particular clarity, the exact moment it stops being careful. When Sheriff Bates arrived, Darius came out of the bunkhouse without being asked. He came across the yard with his coat buttoned and his hat on, and his face arranged into the expression of a man who had spent 2 days preparing a version of events that would serve him. He was still performing. Even now, 12 years of Silver Briar had taught him how to look like the most reliable man in any situation, and he hadn't entirely lost the muscle memory of it. He said to Sheriff Bates, before Bates had even dismounted fully, "There are some things you should know about how this situation has been characterized to you." Bates was a lean 50-year-old with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything roughly 15 years ago. He finished dismounting, handed his reins to his deputy, and looked at Darius. "I expect there are," he said. "You'll have your opportunity to say them." In order, he looked past Darius to where Vivian was standing on the main house steps. "Mrs. Lockridge." "Sheriff Bates," she said. "Thank you for coming. What've you got for me?" "Documents, witnesses, and 3 cattle pastures you can count yourself," she said. "Come inside." The accounting took most of the day. Foswick, the territorial land agent, was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand that sloppiness in their paperwork will come back to them personally in the form of legal challenges and professional embarrassment. He went through Vivian's documentation with the systematic attention of a man building a structure that would have to hold weight under scrutiny. Everett was asked to give his account twice informally to Sheriff Bates in the main room, and once formally to Foswick with a pen moving across paper. He told it the same both times, without additions or subtractions, starting from the cattle count discrepancy he'd noticed on his 3rd day, and ending with Weston in the line station, with Silver Briar's breeding mares and cross ties. Carl and Dutch gave their accounts separately. Dutch's account, delivered in his characteristic economy of words, was nonetheless precise enough that Foswick had to ask him to slow down twice while he caught up with his pen. Carl was more nervous. His hands moved while he talked, and he kept glancing toward the window as if checking something, but his information was solid and consistent. Weston's written statement was read aloud. It named Darius explicitly as the person who had recruited him, explained the $50 payment and the instructions he'd received, and described the operation as Darius had explained it to him, including the claim that the transfers had been authorized by Vivian, which was the element that made Foswick's pen stop moving, and his expression shift to something more active. He told you the owner had authorized the removal of her own breeding stock, Foswick said, to Weston, who had been brought in for the formal accounting. Yes, sir, Weston said. He was very pale. In writing? He said she'd done it verbally, that there wasn't always paperwork for informal transfers. Foswick wrote something down. Darius was given his opportunity to speak, as Bates had promised. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he was good at it, organized, plausible, constructed with enough surface logic to sound reasonable to anyone who hadn't spent 2 days comparing his 2 sets of ledger books side by side. He characterized Everett as an opportunist who had manipulated a vulnerable widow. He characterized the second ledger books as a personal accounting system he'd maintained to track what he privately considered poor management decisions. He characterized the fence crossing points as known weak sections he'd been meaning to repair. Sheriff Bates listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his face professionally neutral. Then he looked at Darius's second ledger books, which Foswick had open on the table, and he said, "This entry here, November 3rd, 42 head moved, South Quarter, delivery Connolly draw, receipt marked V17. What's V17? A silence. It's a receiving notation, Darius said. Who's receiving notation? Another silence. This one had a different quality, the quality of a silence that isn't going to be followed by an answer. Vosix, Bates said. He said it without inflection, as a statement rather than a question. He looked up from the books. How many of those V-atations are in here, mister? Foswick? Foswick turned pages. Across the 2-year period, 19 separate entries. 19. Everett, sitting against the wall with his hat in his hands, had calculated a range of 15 to 23. 19 was inside that range, and it was a number large enough to mean something serious in terms of both dollars and intent. Bates looked at Darius for a long moment. Then he looked at his deputy. Get him outside, he said, and send someone to Vossik's spread. Harlan Vosik arrived at Silver Briar the following morning, under circumstances he had not anticipated. He had been expecting, based on whatever Garrett had managed to communicate after running south through the blizzard, that the situation at Silver Briar had been contained. Garrett had apparently reached Vossik's operation during the storm and reported that there had been a disruption, that the transfer had been interrupted, but Garrett's account had been incomplete because Garrett had run before the full picture was available to him. So Vossik arrived expecting a legal conversation he could manage. He was a large man, 50 or so, with the physical presence of someone who had spent his life using size and certainty to establish the terms of interactions before anyone else could. He had a lawyer with him, a sharp-looking man from Cheyenne named Aldecott, who had the expensive coat and the particular mouth of someone who charged more than he was always worth. He did not have what he expected. He expected a widow in a difficult position. He found Sheriff Bates, a territorial land agent, 2 neighboring ranchers with their own legal counsel, Vivian Lockridge with 2 years of documented theft in her possession, and a new head foreman who had watched Vossik's hired man try to drive Silver Briar cattle across a boundary fence in a blizzard from 30 feet away. The lawyer Aldecott's expression moved through several stages in the first 5 minutes: professional confidence, professional reassessment, and then the particular stillness of a man doing a rapid calculation about his own position in this situation. Vossik tried the version where he knew nothing. He sat in the main room of Silver Briar's house, in a chair that Bates had positioned with deliberate care so that Vossik would be facing the window rather than the door. And he said that he couldn't be held responsible for what a rogue foreman had done with an independent arrangement, that Silver Briar's cattle had come onto his list without his knowledge or direction, that the whole affair was the result of a scheme Darius Blackwell had run independently, and Foswick put the ledger books on the table in front of him. V17, Bates said, through V35. 19 separate notations of receipt, each with a corresponding dollar amount. The receiving party's notation system. He looked at Vossik. Your operation uses a V-series receipt notation for livestock acquisition. Mr. Foswick confirmed that with your livestock records in Cheyenne yesterday. Aldecott put his hand on Vossik's arm, which was a lawyer's signal that meant stop talking now, and Vosek, to his credit, stopped. But the stopping was itself a kind of answer. One of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Pruitt, who had owned land on Silver Briar's north side for 20 years, and who had attended this meeting with the combined energy of a man with his own grievances and sufficient documentation of them, leaned forward and said to Vosek, with the conversational calm of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something, "You tried this with my operation 4 years ago. Different foreman. I couldn't prove it then." He paused. "I can now, because whatever Foswick finds in your receiving records for the last 4 years is going to show a pattern." Vosek looked at him. "Same thing with Kellerman on the east boundary," Pruitt said. "He's not here today, but he sent his documents. He produced an envelope and set it on the table beside Foswick's papers. Apparently you had an arrangement with his former ranch manager as well." The room was quiet. Aldecott was already revising whatever he'd planned to say. It took 3 weeks for the legal mechanism to reach its conclusions. Everett had done enough work in enough different territories to understand that 3 weeks was, in fact, fast for something of this complexity. 2 years of documented theft, 2 cooperating operations, multiple witnesses, a significant body of documentary evidence, and a territorial land claim that Vosek had been quietly preparing based on Silver Briar's anticipated financial distress. That last element, the land claim, was the piece that made the territorial authorities move with unusual speed. Vosek had, it turned out, filed a preliminary claim on Silver Briar's south grazing acreage 6 months earlier, based on a legal instrument that required the claiming party to demonstrate that the landowner was unable to maintain the property. The claim had been quietly filed and quietly waiting, ready to be activated the moment Silver Briar's finances showed the distress that Vosek and Darius had been methodically engineering. Discovering that piece of paper in Foswick's research was the moment Vivian went very still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. Everett was present when Foswick showed it to her. She read it, and she set it down on the desk, and she looked at the wall for a moment without speaking. 6 months, she said. "Yes, ma'am," Foswick said. "He filed this 6 months ago. The date is recorded with the territorial office." She looked at the wall for another moment. Then she said, "How close?" Not dramatically. Just the factual question. Based on the financial picture Blackwell was constructing, another season. Perhaps 2 at the outside. The claim was structured to activate the moment your operation showed a specified level of financial loss. By spring, with the full cattle losses and the manipulated accounts, Foswick didn't finish that. He didn't need to. By spring, she said. Yes, she nodded once. She picked up the document and handed it back to Foswick. "Included in the evidence package," she said, and went back to work. Darius left Silver Briar in Bates's custody 9 days after the storm. He left in the morning, and Everett was the only hand in the yard when the deputy brought him across the yard to the waiting horse. The other hands had found reasons to be elsewhere, not out of cowardice, exactly, but the particular discomfort of watching 12 years end in a specific and terrible way. Darius walked across the yard without hurrying, which was something Everett noted. Whatever else he was, the man didn't shuffle. He reached the horse and looked up at Everett and said, in a voice that was completely flat and completely honest, for the first time in the weeks Everett had known him, "You got here at the wrong time for me." "That's one way to look at it," Everett said. "She would have sold inside of 18 months. She didn't know enough. She knew more than you thought." Darius looked at him. "She knew more after you got here," he said. "Not before." Everett didn't answer that, because it was partially true, and the partial truth of it was not something he wanted to use as an argument. Darius put his foot in the stirrup and mounted, and rode out through Silver Briar's gate without looking back, and the deputy rode beside him, and the gate was the last of it. Everett stood in the yard for a moment after they were gone. Then he went back to work. Garrett was found in Casper 3 weeks later. He'd been trying to arrange a reference from Vosek for a position at a ranch in Montana, which was either brazen or desperate, and either way it didn't work out for him. Bates sent word to Vivian. She acknowledged the information and moved on. Weston, who had cooperated fully and whose testimony had been one of the cleaner pieces of the documentary picture, was given his wages through the end of the month and let go. He accepted this with the expression of a young man who understands he has received a significantly better outcome than he deserved. He thanked Renata specifically, which nobody quite understood, and left. The 14 cattle that had crossed Tavasic's land during the blizzard were recovered formally through the Territorial Land Authority and returned to Silver Briar's south quarter a week after Darius left. They came back thin from the disruption, but otherwise sound. The breeding mares, both of them, had come through the night of the blizzard and the cold line station without lasting damage. Vivian examined them herself the morning after, and then again 3 days later, and then asked the veterinarian who came out from Delwood to confirm what she believed. He confirmed it. She told Everett with the particular relief of someone releasing something they've been holding at a controlled tension for too long. "They're fine," she said. "Both of them. I thought they would be," he said. "The time in the line station wasn't long enough to matter." "I know," she said. "I needed someone else to confirm it." He understood that. Knowing something and needing it confirmed were different things, and the difference was human, and he didn't think less of her for it. The shift in how Silver Briar's neighbors treated Everett happened gradually, in the way such shifts happen. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of small changes in how men looked at him across a fence line, or spoke to him at the feed store, or responded when his name came up in conversation. He had been, when he arrived at Silver Briar, a homeless cowboy with 2 children and an exhausted horse. He had been the kind of man that a foreman like Darius could dismiss at a gate with complete social confidence, because that was the hierarchy of things. A man with nothing had no standing, and a man with no standing was not a real consideration. Then he had saved one of the territory's most significant cattle operations from a 2-year theft scheme while riding into a blizzard at midnight on someone else's horse to recover someone else's breeding stock from the wrong side of a fence line. The math on that was not complicated. Pruitt came to Silver Briar the week after Darius left and asked to speak with Vivian about a grazing arrangement for the following spring. He shook Everett's hand before he went into the house and said, without elaboration, that Silver Briar was lucky to have found him. Everett said he wasn't sure luck was exactly the right word for it. Pruitt looked at him for a moment and said, "Maybe not." But that's the story people are telling, which was, Everett understood, the actual currency in operation here. Not luck, but story, and the way story shapes what people are willing to extend to you in the future. He was still sleeping in the bunkhouse, still taking his meals with the hands, still doing the work of the ranch day by day, from before dawn to after dark, the way he had since the first morning. What had changed was the feeling inside the work. The weeks of sleeping in barns and abandoned line shacks had made him careful about allowing himself to feel settled anywhere, because settled was a precondition to loss, and he'd had enough of that kind. He'd trained himself, over 4 years of drifting, to stay at a specific internal distance from any place he was. Silver Briar was doing something to that distance. He noticed it in specific moments. Tobias working the dark filly in the stable. The horse was coming along now, slowly, in the patient way that was the only way that actually worked. And Tobias had developed a connection with her that was visible in how the animal moved when he came into the barn. Wesley planting the kale correctly under Vivian's supervision, very serious about the crown depth, correcting Renata once when Renata attempted a cut that was too low and being right about it. Caraway's heel, fully healed now, the mare moving sound and clean, and occasionally seeking Everett out over the corral fence, the way horses sometimes did with people they'd decided they trusted. These are not the experiences of a man maintaining his distance. He noticed that and did not do anything about it, the way you don't do anything about a weather change you can see coming but can't stop. Vivian offered him the head foreman position on a Tuesday morning, in the kitchen, over coffee, without preamble. She said, "I want to offer you the position of head foreman of Silver Briar. Full wages, the East Cottage for you and the boys. It's better than the bunkhouse and authority over the operation that I should have extended before now." He sat with his coffee for a moment. "The wages," he said. "Fair," she said. "Better than fair. You should have been receiving them since the second week. The East Cottage. It needs some work. Tobias already pointed out 3 things wrong with it, which means he's been in there inspecting it without being asked, which means he's already decided he wants it." Everett looked at his coffee. He thought about Tobias, inspecting a cottage the way he inspected fence lines and stovepipes, not because anyone told him to, but because he identified things that needed attention and couldn't leave them unexamined. "I'll take the work," he said. "The wages." She looked at him. "But not the cottage, not yet." "Why?" He set the coffee down. This was the conversation he hadn't wanted to have because he hadn't found the version of it that didn't sound like more than he meant to say. Because there are people in this territory who are going to look at what happened here and tell a certain story about it. The homeless cowboy who came in, made himself indispensable, saved the operation, and ended up living in the main cottage of a wealthy widow's ranch. People who tell that story aren't worth... It doesn't matter whether they're worth listening to, he said. What matters is whether it's true. She was quiet for a moment. Is it? She said. No, he said. But I need to make sure it can't be made to look like it is. He picked the coffee back up. I'll take the wages. I'll do the work. The cottage, we can look at it again in the spring. She studied him with the particular attention she brought to things she hadn't expected. You're the most stubborn man I've ever employed, she said. I know, that isn't a compliment. I know that too. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, Spring. We'll discuss it again in spring. And she went back to whatever she'd been doing before the conversation. He sat with his coffee in the empty kitchen and listened to the ranch morning happening outside, the sound of work, of animals, of a place that was being maintained by people who cared whether it survived, and he felt the distance he'd been keeping from Silver Briar contract a little further. He didn't fight it. He just sat with it, the way you sit with weather you can't stop. Wesley had questions about the East Cottage. Specifically about whether the upstairs bedroom had a window that faced the mountains, because he had opinions about which direction he should be sleeping relative to the mountains. And these opinions were detailed and not fully coherent, but deeply held. Tobias had a list, an actual list, written in pencil on a scrap of paper, of everything he'd identified in the cottage that needed attention. He presented it to Everett after supper one evening with the serious delivery of a professional report. It ran to 11 items, organized roughly by urgency. Everett looked at the list. When did you go through there? He said. A few days ago, Tobias said. Mrs. Lockridge said it was all right. Did she? She said I should feel free to take stock. A pause. I think she meant the condition of the cottage. I wasn't sure if she meant it more generally. Everett looked at his son for a moment. What did you think she meant? Tobias considered this with the careful seriousness he brought to things that mattered. I think she meant it more generally, he said finally. But I started with the cottage because that seemed the most practical. Everett looked at the list. Item 1, front door hinge, right side, screws backing out. Item 2, window frame south-facing, has a gap that will let cold air through. Item 3, stovepipe, same problem as the bunkhouse, joint needs resecuring. He almost smiled. The boy had gone through the cottage and found the same categories of problem he'd learned from watching Everett work for 3 weeks. Hinges, windows, stovepipes. The practical architecture of keeping cold out and warm in. I'll look at the hinge tomorrow, Everett said. Tobias nodded, satisfied, and took the list back and folded it and put it in his pocket. The formal documentation of everything was completed by the end of November, 3.5 weeks after the night of the blizzard. Foswick filed the relevant materials with the Territorial Land Authority. The preliminary claim Vosick had filed on Silver Briar's south grazing land was invalidated and removed. Vosick faced a separate proceeding on the theft charges that would take considerably longer to resolve, but the land claim, the piece that would have mattered most to Silver Briar's future, was gone. Vivian received this news on a Wednesday and spent 20 minutes alone in the office with the door closed. When she came out, she went directly to the kitchen and asked Renata to make something good for supper, and then she went to find the boys. She found Wesley in the kitchen garden, which was his habitual location in any weather that was technically survivable. Doing something to the kale she'd asked him not to interfere with until spring, but had apparently decided required immediate attention. The kale, she said. I'm just checking the crowns, he said. To make sure they're not frozen. Are they? Mostly not. He stood up. Are you sad? No, she said. I'm not sad. You look like something happened. Something good happened. She crouched down to his level, which she'd learned to do sometime in the second week, because Wesley conducted his serious conversations eye to eye, and found anything else slightly dismissive. The men who were trying to take the ranch they can't anymore. It's settled. Wesley looked at her with the steady assessment of a child evaluating the full truth content of an adult statement. Forever, for this, she said. We'll deal with whatever comes next when it comes. He considered this. That's what my papa says. It's good advice. He says it about lots of things, Wesley said. He says you can only fix what's in front of you. He looked at the kale. I think the crowns are okay. I think so too, she said. She stood back up. The cold of the garden was the kind that was pleasant for about 5 minutes and unpleasant after that, and Wesley had been out here long enough that his nose was red at the tip. Come inside, she said. Renata's making something good. What kind of something? I don't know yet. That's why it'll be interesting. Wesley pulled off his gardening gloves. They were Renata's gloves, far too large, but he wore them anyway with a practical indifference to appearance, and followed her toward the house. At the kitchen door, he stopped and said, without particular transition, I like living here. She looked at him. I know we're in the bunkhouse, he said. But I mean here, Silver Briar. He said the ranch's name with the careful pronunciation of someone who has made a decision about how a word should be said. I like it here. She stood in the kitchen doorway with this 6-year-old in Renata's oversized gloves looking up at her, and she felt something that she had not allowed herself to feel with any clarity since her husband had died, the specific warmth of a house that was populated rather than merely occupied. I'm glad, she said. I like having you here. He seemed satisfied with this exchange and went inside, and she followed him, and the kitchen door closed on the cold. The conversation she'd been not having with Everett lived in the space between every other conversation they did have, which was frequent and practical and increasingly easy in the way of two people who have moved through enough difficult situations together that the difficulty has become a kind of shared grammar. She was not a woman who let things she hadn't decided accumulate without noticing. She noticed this one. She noticed the way he was careful about distance without being cold, the way he spoke to her directly and honestly about everything regarding the ranch, and nothing regarding himself unless she asked directly. She noticed the way he moved in the space of Silver Briar as if he'd been part of it for years, not weeks, and simultaneously the way he never quite let that comfort go all the way down, like a man who has trained himself not to trust the floor completely. She understood it. She didn't take it personally. She'd spent 2 years surrounded by men who wanted things from her, and she recognized the particular shape of a man who was trying very hard not to be that. It didn't make it simpler. One evening in late November after supper, she found him at the East Cottage. He had Tobias's list in his pocket, and he was replacing the right side door hinge, working by lantern light in the cold, doing it the way he did everything, without hurry, with the attention of someone who understands that a hinge done wrong will fail at the worst possible moment. She stood in the doorway of the cottage and watched him work for a moment. You don't have to do that tonight, she said. I know, he said, without stopping. It's cold. I know that too. She came further into the cottage. The lantern made the room smaller and warmer than it actually was, an old building trick. The way contained light makes space feel inhabited. She looked at the room the way she'd been looking at it since Tobias had asked her if he could inspect it, not as a storage space or an unused outbuilding, but as a room that could be lived in by specific people she had feelings about. The boys are asleep, she said. Wesley put himself to bed at 8, he said, which means he was up to something at 7 that he expected to get in trouble for. He trimmed the kale again. He set the screwdriver down and tested the hinge, opened the door, closed it, opened it again. It moved cleanly, without the slight drag it had before. He believes in the kale. He believes in most things with a growing component, she said. He found 3 seeds in his coat pocket last week, from that woman in Laramie, and he's been treating them like they're made of glass. He'll plant them in spring. He picked up the lantern and looked at the door frame. He's been asking me whether the garden here gets enough south-facing light. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know. That he'd have to ask you. She looked at him in the lantern light. He was looking at the doorframe, not at her, but with the particular quality of attention that meant he was aware of the room in its entirety while appearing to examine one specific part of it. Everett, she said. He looked at her. I want you to know something, she said. And I need you to let me finish saying it before you say anything practical back at me. He waited. When you arrived at this gate, she said, and then stopped and started differently, because the beginning she'd chosen wasn't right. I have spent 2 years making decisions alone, not because I wanted to, but because every person who offered to help turned out to want something specific that I couldn't give without losing something I wasn't willing to lose. She paused. And then you showed up. With your sons and your $43 and your list of everything that needed fixing, and you didn't want anything except work and a roof. That's still all I want, he said. I know that, she said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I know it because you've demonstrated it every single day for the past 7 weeks in ways that couldn't be faked. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you anything tonight. I'm not trying to change what we've agreed about the spring. I just wanted you to know that I see you clearly. Not what you were when you rode through the gate. What you are. He looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light of the cottage he was fixing with his son's list in his pocket. I don't know how to respond to that, he said. You don't have to, she said. That's the point. You don't have to do anything with it. She moved toward the cottage door. Good hinge, she said. It'll hold, he said. She walked back to the main house through the cold dark, and he stood in the cottage for a while after she left with the lantern in his hand and the cottage door swinging clean and easy on its new hinge. And he thought about everything that had happened in 7 weeks, and the distance that Silver Briar had been systematically and quietly eliminating since the morning he'd ridden through the gate with $43 and 2 cold. Boys and a horse that was favoring her left foreleg. He thought about the East Cottage and the winter ahead and spring. He blew out the lantern and walked back to the bunkhouse where his sons were sleeping and the stove was holding. He didn't move Wesley back from the edge of the cot tonight. He just stood in the dark and looked at his boys and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, the specific shape of something he had almost stopped believing was still available to him. Not a decision. Not yet. Just the knowledge that it was there. Spring came to Silver Briar the way it always came to Wyoming reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold snapping back just when the ground had begun to soften and the light had begun to stay past supper. There were 3 more snowfalls after December, one of them serious enough to keep everyone close to the buildings for 2 days. And then one morning in late March, Everett walked outside, and the air had changed, and the mud under his boots was the particular soft mud of ground that has finally decided to thaw all the way down. He stood in the yard and breathed it in and thought, spring. He had been thinking about spring since November. The wagon was packed on a Tuesday, not because he'd planned it for a Tuesday specifically, it wasn't that considered. It was more that he'd woken up in the bunkhouse that morning and lain there in the gray pre-dawn and had a conversation with himself that he'd been postponing since the night he'd stood in the East Cottage with the lantern and felt the shape of something he hadn't let himself name yet. He named it now in the dark of the bunkhouse, with his sons asleep beside him, and the ranch outside doing what it did every morning, waking up, breathing, beginning. He named it, and then he lay there with it for about 20 minutes, and then he got up and started packing the wagon because he was a man who had spent 4 years learning that wanting something was the most dangerous thing you could do, and the lesson had not fully left him even now. He worked quietly. He didn't wake the boys. He told himself he was doing them a kindness, letting them sleep, that he would explain when he had the words, that he would find somewhere good, that they would be all right, that he had been managing all right before Silver Briar, and he would manage all right after. He told himself that for about an hour. He was hitching the second trace on the harness when he heard the main house door. He didn't turn around. He kept working with the trace, and he heard her footsteps cross the yard, not hurrying, not slow, and then she stopped about 6 feet behind him and was quiet. He finished the trace, he straightened up. He turned around. Vivian was standing in the morning cold with her coat over her nightclothes and her hair down and her boots not fully laced, which meant she had seen the wagon from the house window and come out without finishing getting dressed, which was the least composed he had ever seen her, and which told him something about what the sight of the packed wagon had cost her. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Don't," she said. It was one word. It was not a command and it was not a plea. It was something in between the kind of word that a person says when they have used up the version of themselves that calculates the right thing to say and are left with only the true thing. Vivian, no, she said. You told me in November that you weren't staying because you didn't want anyone to think you wanted the money or the ranch or the name. I understood that. I respected it. I waited. She stopped and started again. I have spent 2 years becoming very good at watching men want things from me and knowing exactly what each of them wanted. You were the first man in 2 years who wanted nothing from me that I wasn't willing to give. She paused. And now you're leaving because you're afraid of wanting something. He didn't say anything. That's what this is, she said. You're not protecting me. You're protecting yourself. The truth of that landed the way true things land, not like a blow, but like something settling into place that you cannot then pretend you didn't hear. I've had a good reason to leave everywhere I've been for 4 years, he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, every time. There was always a good reason. I know, she said. I think you've gotten very good at finding them. The jury was quiet. The morning light was coming up thin and clear, and somewhere in the stable one of the horses was moving, and the sound of it was the sound of a place that was fully alive, and had been for a while now. Longer than Everett Clayborne had been planning to be part of it. He heard the bunkhouse door. Tobias came out first in his coat and his boots, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has understood the situation before he was told what the situation was. He looked at the wagon. He looked at his father. He looked at Vivian. He came to stand beside Vivian, which was not something Everett had told him to do, and which was the most direct thing his son had communicated to him in 9 years of being his son. Wesley appeared in the bunkhouse doorway a moment later, took in the scene, and came across at a speed that suggested he had processed the essential facts and determined that proximity was required. He arrived beside Vivian and took her hand, not because she asked him to, but because he was 6, and he did things like that. And she looked down at him and then back at Everett with the expression of a woman who has been handed evidence at exactly the right moment. Everett looked at his sons. He looked at the wagon he'd spent an hour packing. He thought about 4 years of good reasons. 4 years of barns and line shacks, and the particular weight of being a man who moves through places without leaving a mark. Because leaving a mark means the mark is there when you go, and going is easier if you haven't left anything behind. He thought about the East Cottage with its new door hinge. He thought about Wesley's seeds from Laramie, planted in the south-facing garden bed 2 weeks ago, in the ground of Silver Briar, in soil that belonged somewhere. Tobias said, Papa. Just that. Just his name. And then maybe being strong doesn't always mean knowing when to leave. Everett looked at his son, this 9-year-old who had been carrying things too heavy for 9 years, for as long as Everett could remember, who had sat on an upturned bucket outside a frightened horse's stall for 40 minutes, because he understood that sometimes the right thing was just to stay, and felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. He looked at Vivian. I don't know how to do this, he said. I'm telling you that honestly. I don't know how to stay somewhere. Not anymore. I've been moving for so long that I don't know what it looks like to stop. I know, she said. I don't know how to let someone help me without waiting for what it costs. We're both bad at this. That's not reassuring. No, she said. It isn't. But it's true, and we could start there. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was doing what morning light did, making everything slightly more serious and slightly more possible at the same time. Vivian stood in the yard of her ranch with her hair down and her boots not laced, and Wesley's hand in hers, and she was not asking him to be something he wasn't. She was asking him to stop moving long enough to find out what he was when he held still. He stepped down from the wagon. Wesley made a sound that was somewhere between a word and not. And then he let go of Vivian's hand and crossed the yard and hit Everett somewhere around the midsection, with the full force of a 6-year-old who has been worried about something and has just been relieved of it. Everett put his hand on the back of the boy's head and held him there. Tobias didn't move for a moment. Then he walked to his father and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in the way he'd started doing sometime in the past month, the way of a boy who has decided that standing beside someone is its own kind of statement. Vivian looked at the three of them. She had spent 2 years in a house that was large and well-furnished and fundamentally empty in the way that spaces become empty when the person they were built around is gone. She had filled it with work, with management, with the daily discipline of keeping Silver Briar running through her own grief and her own caution and her own slowly built understanding that wealth without people in it was just inventory. "Come inside," she said. "Renata will have breakfast started." "The wagon," Everett said. "Unpack it later," she said. "Or don't. We'll put it in the barn." She paused. "It can stay as long as you need it to stay there." Which was, he understood, her way of saying, you don't have to give up the door. You just don't have to use it today. He left the wagon where it was and walked with his sons into the main house of Silver Briar Ranch, where Renata was starting the stove and the kitchen was beginning to fill with the smell of something warm. And the light came through the east windows, the way it would come through them every morning now for as long as they chose to be here to see it. They married in September. Not a large ceremony. That wasn't what either of them wanted. Pruitt came, and Dutch and Carl and his wife, and their daughter from Delwood, and Renata, and a small number of neighbors who had watched Silver Briar survive what it had survived and understood what the occasion meant. Tobias stood beside his father. Wesley stood beside Vivian, because he had decided that was the appropriate arrangement, and nobody had successfully argued him out of it. The officiant said the necessary words. Everett and Vivian said theirs. Wesley at one point contributed an unquestioned observation about the importance of the occasion, which got a laugh from everyone present and a look from Tobias that communicated clearly that this was not a surprise. Afterward, Everett stood on the porch of the main house, his house now, or theirs, which was a concept he was still learning to hold without flinching, and looked out at Silver Briar in the September light. The cattle were in the pastures. The breeding mares were in the south stable, healthy and settled. The dark filly that Tobias had spent months on was moving in the near paddock, with the ease of an animal that has finally learned that not everything coming toward her is a threat. Not elegant yet, still sometimes spooky on the left side. Still with a particular tightness in her hindquarters that she might carry the rest of her life. But moving forward. The kale in the kitchen garden was growing correctly, the crowns intact, because Wesley had appointed himself its permanent guardian and took this responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understands that growing things require showing up consistently, not dramatically. Tobias came out onto the porch and stood beside him. "Happy?" Everett said. Tobias thought about it, which was what he did with every question worth answering. "Yes," he said, "I think so." He paused. "It's strange. Being somewhere without wondering when we're leaving." "I know," Everett said. "Does it get less strange?" "I think so," Everett said. "I think eventually it just becomes where you live." They stood on the porch together in the September light and looked at the ranch that was home now. Not by accident, not because there had been nowhere else to go, but because 4 people had separately decided, over the course of one difficult winter, that belonging somewhere required the particular courage of staying when you had every reason to understand what leaving felt like. Not all stories arrive clean. Not all decisions are brave when you make them. Sometimes you pack the wagon and you stand in the yard with the traces hitched for an hour before someone comes out of the house and says one word to you, and the word is right, and you step down. That's the thing nobody tells you about home. It isn't the place. It isn't even the people, entirely. It's the decision you make, in the cold light of an early spring morning, to stop letting fear be the thing that makes your choices. Everett Clayborne had been making his choices out of fear for 4 years. Fear of loss, fear of want, fear of marking a place with himself, and then having to watch himself leave it. He made a different choice on a Tuesday morning in late March, and the difference was not that it was easy. It was that he made it anyway. That's all home ever is for anyone. The one you choose when you're afraid, and you choose it anyway, and then you stay.